Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Was the Last Human on Earth? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. 2240. Everything seemed normal at first. Izuku Midoriya woke up late. His mother hadn't woken him up, but she probably just went to work already. He went through his daily routine, breathing out in an attempt at fire breath, focusing on the All Might figure on the desk in case he had telekinesis, even testing for teleportation. Nothing. Izuku tried not to let the disappointment get to him at yet another failure as he started his trek to school. According to the quirk doctor, he had an invisible quirk, complete with the extra toe joint. The doctor had been confused by the test results. No one was quirkless by this generation. It had been 9 years since he was diagnosed, however, and Izuku Midoriya was still powerless, and had nothing. Defenseless. Useless. Every other kid at school had an ability, ranging from relatively weak things like an intelligence enhancer to powerful quirks known for combat, such as explosion. If only he could have something cool like that. A normal person would have probably given up on their dream, especially when it required fighting supervillains. But Izuku didn't give up easily. Izuku was drawn out of his thoughts by a strange feeling. Something was missing, but he didn't know what. Maybe he forgot something at home? He checked his bag, but nothing was forgotten. His phone, wallet, and lunch were all there. But then it hit him. It was too quiet. He couldn't hear the sound of chirping birds, the bustling of cars as they zoomed by, or any soft conversations around him. Izuku looked around, but there were 0 people. There were cars, but none of them were moving. Izuku took a deep breath to calm himself, his analytical mind racing. Clearly, he wasn't in any immediate danger, and there were no villains nearby. Maybe he had been transported by some kind of quirk? Or this was a dream? Nothing seemed different. The city the same, only missing people. The second possibility was ruled out after Izuku pinched himself and nothing happened. Izuku checked Aldra Junior High just to be sure, but there wasn't a single soul in any of the classrooms. So instead of him being gone, everyone else was. Meaning someone with some kind of warp quirk had kidnapped everyone. Everyone but him. Which didn't make any sense. Why was he left behind? His mom wasn't picking up despite his attempts to reach her, something he was doing his best not to dwell on. She was all he had after all. It was getting dark. Izuku had been wandering for hours, but he still had no answers, only gaining more questions. There was nothing new in the news since yesterday, meaning that an incredibly powerful warp quirk had been used on an entire city and no one outside had even noticed. Which was impossible. Warp quirks were already extremely rare, and one this strong would have been Dokkan. Izuku paused, drawn out of his muttering spree by a flash of purple. He had zoned out, and in his walk back from the school Izuku had ended up at the neighborhood park. Turning to the left, he saw her. She was sitting on a bench, watching the stars as they started to grow visible. Izuku's eyes were drawn to the pink kimono the girl was wearing first, but then he noticed her hair. It was shimmering, stars shifting in her purple hair. What an interesting quirk. The realization that this was another person, finally, that might know what happened hit him a second later. "Excuse me?" She turned to him as he approached, her eyes widening in shock. "Do you know where everyone went?" Izuku asked. She stood up, still staring at him. Izuku was about to try English when she finally spoke. "Are you a human?" Izuku took a second to make sure he heard that right. Obviously, he was human. Even if he wasn't always treated as such. Did that mean she wasn't human? Or maybe she was one of those UFO watchers? Was she an alien? Izuku looked at her face again. She was beautiful, astonishingly so, but she didn't seem like an extraterrestrial. That had been flawless Japanese after all. "Ah, so you are human. I'm not an alien by the way." Izuku blinked. Did he just say all of that out loud? Yes. Izuku blushed, shutting his mouth. "You must be quirkless then," the girl commented. His first instinct was to deny it, but the words stopped in his throat. He was clearly powerless. And for some reason, Izuku didn't sense any of the distaste of the word he was used to. She used the term as a fact instead of a terrible medical condition. Izuku hadn't even met anyone who treated something so hated normally besides his mother. Who are you? Izuku gathered up the courage to ask. She smiled and the dimly lit park got a little brighter. I am Aurora, goddess of light. I'm Izuku Midoriya. It's nice to meet you, Aurora-san. Izuku wasn't too sure about the goddess thing, but with how bizarre his world was he just decided to think about it later. A thought struck him then. WB, is that why your family name? He stammered out. Aurora seemed to be confused at his embarrassment for a moment, before understanding showed in her eyes. Right? Using someone's given name is considered rude here. Still, Aurora is fine, she said. Izuku still felt a bit odd, but it wasn't like he had anything else to call her. Aurora-san, how did you know I was quirkless? He asked, tilting his head. In response, Aurora motioned for him to sit down on the bench next to her. Izuku took the seat, getting a better glance at her clothes in the process. The pink kimono was intricately designed, but unlike anything he had ever seen before. She looked up at the stars, her expression growing thoughtful like she was wondering how to phrase her next words. It was now night, the stars fully visible. Humanity is gone. They've all been transported. Aurora spoke softly, as if she didn't say billions of people had been moved. She continued, sensing his shock. Your dimension is set to collide with another soon. This normally would not be much of an issue, but this other dimension is filled with dangerous creatures. She paused for a second in thought. I suppose you would call them monsters? Izuku vaguely thought this sounded like some sort of video game. Then again, hundreds of years ago the idea of everyone having superpowers would have seemed crazy. Now the most famous celebrity was a giant man in red and blue changing the weather with a punch. Humanity was sent to different fantasy worlds based on their quirks and dreams to prepare. Combative humans were sent to fight monsters, such as heroes. The rest had more peaceful lives, but still had the opportunity to get used to monsters. That's why I'm still here, isn't it? And how you knew I was quirkless? I couldn't be transported because I had no quirk. Aurora nodded. What about children? Wouldn't they be alone? Izuku asked. Kids separated from their parents in a strange world. What would happen to babies? The thought made his gut clench. She shook her head, not bothered by the barrage of questions. The stars in her hair twinkled from the motion. Depending on the parents, they'll either be sent with them or put into an orphanage of sorts until they are sent back to Earth. Where was my mom sent? Izuku finally asked the question that had been burning inside him for hours. If she was in danger, then there was nothing he could do to help her. Izuku doubted Aurora was allowed to take him wherever she was. Give me a moment. Aurora closed her eyes, before turning her gaze towards him. Inko Midoriya was sent to the Dimension Nourishment. It's a world focused on hunting monsters, but all of the ones there are relatively harmless. It's peaceful too. She was safe. Izuku let out a breath, the weight on his shoulders feeling lighter. When are they coming back? Izuku questioned hopefully. He'd have to wait here a few months maybe, but he could. I don't know. Aurora sighed. Earth has been frozen in time until they come back. Humanity will spend 5 years before returning. However, time passes slower there. Meaning while they have an adventure, it could be 10 or 1,000,000 years before they return. Izuku's eyes widened. Then what about height? You will have to wait for them. Her beautiful eyes grew softer in sympathy. Izuku Midoriya, you are the only human left on Earth. The first few months were a blur. Aurora visited once a week, always appearing at the park. She brought him a week's worth of food as well as ingredients. Izuku wasn't an amazing cook, but he knew enough from the times his mother had worked late. He ignored the pang in his heart at the thought of Inko Midoriya. Izuku practiced making katsudon the most, the meal holding a special place in his heart. Aurora supplied him with pork, definitely not opposed to tastier meals. He had small chats with Aurora, though lasting long from lack of common ground. Aurora was a goddess after all, and Izuku didn't exactly have the most social life even before humanity was whisked away. Some days she spent the meeting ranting about the latest issue in her world. Aurora was really expressive when she got into things. Izuku chuckled softly as she waved her hands around wildly. And then she blew up my dress. But is not having a battle in it that hard? Her eyes wide. Izuku appreciated her company a lot. He threw himself into books. There was no one to stop him from walking into the library and laying there all day. It almost felt like a crime when he yelled out after stubbing his toe and nobody shushed him. Reading helped get his mind of the feeling of loneliness and his current situation. While Izuku would usually be studying all the new heroes, keeping up his perfect trivia knowledge, what was the point? It wasn't like he was going to see a hero nowadays anyway. Instead, armed with a pillow and blanket, he started studying. Izuku didn't realize just how much the term nerds applied to him until he was given all the time in the world and picked up a medical textbook. Healing would definitely be useful when monsters were running around, he figured. He wanted to be a hero, not a doctor, so he focused on the basics and how to help someone immediately. Learning medicine was hard without an actual teacher. Izuku had practice dummies from med schools. Izuku was quickly learning that it really didn't matter if he broke into places, but no living thing to help him. When he told Aurora about his roadblock, she stared at him a moment before lifting her hand, purple light illuminating the park as a blade of light rose out of it until the handle rested in her grip. She then made a decent-sized cut in her other palm before holding the injured hand out to him, waiting. Naturally, Izuku immediately panicked at her thoughtless self-harm. He barely noticed how Aurora's blood wasn't red, more of a gold color as it leaked from the wound. Then the medical knowledge crammed in his brain over months took over, and he cleaned the wound. She hit it well, but Izuku noticed her tiny flinch from the water. He wrapped her hand back at his house. Izuku had plenty of bandages from how much he had to deal with his own cuts and burns. Really, the only people Izuku missed were his mother and heroes. Almost everyone else he saw treated him as trash. He hid his frown as an angry blonde came to mind, along with all the adults who didn't care about his behavior. Izuku would be happy if he never had to see Bakugo again. You didn't have to do that. He muttered under his breath when he finished with the injury. Aurora still heard him, however, her hand squeezing his before she responded. It's because of us you're left alone. Humanity wasn't even kind to you, and you still prepare for their return. The least I could do is help. They sat there, a nice silence lasting between them. His empty house didn't feel too lonely right now. She spoke up again a few minutes later. Not that I mind, but how long are you going to hold my hand? Izuku made a sound akin to a distressed cat before letting go, his face red. Aurora's laugh sounded like bells as it filled the room. 2241. Izuku pushed the fridge with all his might, finally getting it into the truck. His arms felt like they were going to fall off, so he would probably stop here for today. He looked around at the various trash piled up, everything from kitchen appliances to cars. Izuku even found guns there. He had started cleaning up Dagoba Beach while exploring the city. Even after over a year, strolling through a city completely devoid of people felt strange. It was also impossible to ignore the giant heap of trash, especially after seeing pictures of the beach in its glory. He had used a truck nearby to move his piles. Knowing how to drive didn't really matter when there was nothing to crash into. While residents might love it being restored once they returned, he was also doing it for himself. The feeling of needing to accomplish something was powerful. Izuku figured it also doubled as strength training. Aurora didn't question his methods, although she did tell him to try going to a gym as well. He did. Being able to freely use expensive gym equipment was definitely nice after all. Since he only saw Aurora on Saturdays, he spent the rest of the time training. His body felt like it was dying, but he felt happy at the thought of getting stronger. Izuku wanted to keep up his reading time as well, but Aurora had caught on to the bags under his eyes and made him stop. There was no one else left to tell him to mind his health after all. When the rest of humanity came back, they would be even stronger from their adventures, with more developed quirks. According to Aurora, they could learn magic based on their quirks as well. Izuku didn't grill her on magic too much though. It was strange. Izuku loved talking about quirks. But thinking about magic, something that sounded so incredible and foreign, something he would never have, Izuku felt bitter. This was probably the way quirkless people had thought about quirks, back when others existed. He still had at least a few pages filled with Aurora's light magic, how she could use it directly in offensive bursts or form tools and enhance herself. Izuku still didn't know how the teleportation that she used to get to the god's realm and back functioned. How weird would it be when everyone came back with stronger quirks and magic? The heroes would be stronger, but so would the villains. Civilian casualties would probably increase. Izuku winced as he thought of the typical hero fight. A villain fighting a hero or several heroes, all with flashy, dangerous quirks. Despite this, civilians crowded around, enjoying the show from far too close. People brought their children, excited to see their heroes risk their lives in person. Many limelight heroes were into heroism for fame or money after all. Fights were drawn out, risking lives for the thrill of a climatic ultimate move. Now that Izuku had time to actually think about it, completely separated from the hero media he had been dedicated to before, society seemed pretty bad. That was even ignoring how bad his life had been for being quirkless. Maybe he would ask Aurora how exactly magic fit into quirks later. If he was still going to be a hero, he would need to fight them after all. The gap between the quirked and quirkless would only grow wider when humanity returned. In comparison, the only thing Izuku had was his body and mind. All he could do was prepare as much as possible. 2243. They had moved their weekly meetings to Dagoba Beach. It had taken almost a year of hard work. Once cleaned, however, the view was absolutely beautiful. Izuku sometimes wondered how people could ruin something like this. His physical training was definitely yielding results. Izuku had a decent base to start learning technique. Hey Aurora? Eventually, she had gotten him to drop. Honorifics. Really, she was the only friend Izuku had since he was 4. Yes, Izuku? He still wasn't used to her doing the same though. See, can you train me? Izuku asked. Aurora turned towards him, the sunlight reflecting in her hair. Would it be rude to take a hair to study? Izuku has been getting into chemistry lately. On second thought, that would definitely be creepy. He shouldn't do that. Oh gods, his social skills were getting even worse. I can't make you my student, she answered. His thoughts must have shown on his face because she explained. I fight almost completely using magic. Most of my fighting style wouldn't be useful to you. However, I can show you the basics of the god style. She took a stance, her legs bent and spread apart, hands at her side. The gods were humanoid, so their techniques could technically be learned by humans. However, divinity was a style usually refined over decades. Aurora said this like it was nothing, but to Izuku that sounded incredibly complicated. Gods possessed incredible amounts of physical strength, even ones who didn't focus on hand-to-hand combat such as Aurora. Divinity was simple to learn but incredibly hard to master, focused on combining overwhelming power with perfect precision and technique. They spent the rest of the day going through the basic stances, as well as how to punch and kick correctly. Izuku practiced them until they started to feel natural. 2250. Izuku had started incorporating human styles, mainly karate, into his combat. He had seen fun forms of combat such as capoeira in various books and media, but decided it wouldn't fit him. That hadn't stopped him from learning to breakdance though. Sparring had been a spur-of-the-moment decision from her after deciding he was finally strong enough. Aurora didn't use her magic, but her natural strength still felt like getting hit by a truck despite how much she held back. He forgot sometimes, but she really was a goddess. Aurora could probably easily take down the heroes in his world. Izuku could feel himself slowly reaching her in terms of technique after relentless practice. On some days, where he was sure that the world of gods had been stressing her out, they worked on his reflexes and dodging. This consisted of bombarding the beach with giant beams of violet light, sending sand into the air and making the beach shake. The most terrifying, however, was her spears of light. On those days he wasn't sure Aurora noticed how much power she was putting in. It took all of his concentration not to get vaporized. How powerful was she when she went all out? Izuku resolved himself to one day be strong enough to find out. 2274. Izuku decided to choose a weapon. He would need something to kill monsters. He was confident in his hand-to-hand combat, but he would definitely be more effective with a tool. Punching a dragon in the face wouldn't work very well after all. He had asked Aurora for advice, but he'd merely gotten to use what feels right before she went back to her shoujo manga. Izuku regretted letting her know about manga sometimes. Aurora had gotten addicted instantly. She turned out to be right about weapons. After a short period of trial and error in the dojo, he picked up a quarterstaff. With the extremely helpful martial arts book, Izuku followed the instructions. The recommended stance was simple. His feet were set wider than he was used to with the god style, probably to compensate for the length of the weapon. The dominant foot was in front, with the dominant hand placed near the middle. Going through the rest of the attacks felt smooth. Izuku knew that he had quite a long time to train. It was easy to dismiss something not sharp, but blunt weapons could do quite a lot of damage with enough strength behind them. His mind flashed back to Aurora's fist knocking him out for 5 hours, making him shudder. The staff would hurt a lot, but if he held back he wouldn't have to worry about killing villains or giving them brain damage. At the same time, with enough force he could deal with monsters. Izuku could work with this. The next 2 months was spent practicing the basics and ingraining them into his muscle memory. Aurora raised an eyebrow when he brought a staff to the next session. He had borrowed a durable metal staff to use. The green-haired man took his shoes off and got into stance. Getting sand into his shoes would suck. He gripped his staff tightly, waiting. Aurora made the first move, shooting forward, as her feet left imprints on the sand. Her magic curled around her like a coat, violet light emitting outward as she stabbed forward with a light spear. Izuku diverted the blade with the top of his staff before swinging the bottom at her chin. She was already moving though, ducking under the attack before rising up towards him. His eyes widened as her palm lit up. He was too slow to dodge the light blast, and the blow sent him tumbling away in the sand. The breath was knocked out of him for a moment. Even while she was holding back, he wasn't fast enough. Recovering, Izuku stood up with the aid of his staff in time to see Aurora charging up both hands, the energy condensing in her palms. This was usually the part where Izuku would run around screaming as light destroyed everything around him. But this time he was ready. He carefully controlled the staff with all of his focus, blocking the bursts. Izuku winced as a particularly strong bolt of energy made the metal crack. Izuku needed a better staff. Whatever he couldn't block, he dodged as he broke into a sprint, closing the distance before making a downward feint with the staff. Aurora fell for it, raising up a blade of light to block the blow. Izuku focused all of his speed into his next movement, transitioning the downward strike into a straight punch to her stomach. It landed, the blow sending Aurora skidding back. Izuku felt a wide grin start to appear on his face. The strike probably did nothing to her, but he had landed a hit. This was progress. They stopped by a restaurant to cool down after a few more spars. The day was almost up, and after they ate Aurora would need to go back to the god's realm. While there was no one there to actually make food for them, they could bring food to replicate the experience. Somehow, the atmosphere was still there. The cold night air didn't feel lonely when Izuku sat there with her. They ate a bento Izuku had made that morning. His cooking had certainly gotten better years of practice. Aurora closed her eyes in bliss as she took another bite of the katsudon. Izuku felt a small smile form at her reaction. She had been slowly giving him his confidence back these years, something he could never thank her enough for. Something as simple as a compliment on something he worked hard on or a new skill he learned. Things Izuku rarely got when quirkless. He had even stopped stuttering. Aurora asked him about a hero she had seen a poster of earlier. The hero caught her attention by being known as the youngest pro hero, yet still so high up in the rankings. The poster was filled with his bright smile and large red wings. Izuku opened his mouth to answer, then froze. Who was that again? As much as he racked his brain, he just couldn't remember who it was. According to the poster, the hero was ranked 3rd. Izuku definitely had notes on him, so why couldn't he recall who they were? You're forgetting, aren't you? Izuku looked up at her concerned face, eyes narrowing in sorrow. Aurora set the paper face down on the table. Things have passed by so fast. However, your mind is still human. You haven't seen a hero in years, so you are slowly forgetting them, she explained. He was forgetting. In hindsight, it was strange it had taken him so long to realize. Of course he wouldn't remember someone he hadn't heard of in years. His brain would think of it as unused knowledge. That didn't mean forgetting what life was like before didn't worry him. Suddenly, another thought struck him. Izuku hastily searched his memories, before breathing out in relief. He could still remember a short woman with green hair, her smile as she saw the All Might video yet again with him. Aurora knew him well enough to not say anything. They ate the rest of the meal in peaceful silence. The deserted restaurant was starting to feel more natural than one filled with people. When he got home, he set up a reminder on his phone. Every week, videos of his mother would play. Every week, so he could repay everything she did when she came back. Every week, so he never forgot her. After a moment's thought, Izuku also set a counter to track the years. It had been 34 years. By human standards, he wasn't even considered a teenager anymore. That was definitely a shock. Would he need to act like a teenager when everyone came back? People would change after 5 years. How much would he change after far more than that? Izuku guessed he would need to wait another few decades. If only he knew how wrong he was. 2296. Izuku leapt to the side, instincts kicking in. He felt the rush of air as the ball tore past him at incredible speed before smashing into the building behind him. Really? He asked, slightly alarmed. Sorry, came the yell from the other side of the court. Izuku sighed, picking another ball from the bag. Izuku had been experimenting with various sports to play while bored. He came across tennis in a magazine and wanted to try it. He had almost no experience with games. With no friends, Izuku had no one to play with. After Izuku showed her an image to use as reference, Aurora set up a tennis court made completely out of light on Dagoba Beach. Violet light represented boundaries, formed into a net, and covered the sand below them for a flat surface. Magic really was incredibly useful. Tennis was something that was impossible for him to practice when she wasn't there, but that just meant they could get better at the sport together. If there was anyone else there to see them, they would be amazed at the game. A ball of light zooming back and forth at incredible speeds across a court of light, both players moving at similar velocity. Aurora was having the time of her life. Her starry hair waved wildly, somehow not getting in her face. Aurora's smile was wide, almost blinding as Izuku was reminded once again why she was a goddess of light. The warm feeling in his chest must surely be her magic. Aurora didn't seem to be tiring from the match. To her, supersonic tennis was probably light exercise. Izuku, on the other hand, was using all of his concentration to keep up. Using practiced reflexes to predict the ball, he could make up for his current lack of speed. The effort was taxing though, and after a few hours Izuku's t-shirt was drenched in sweat. After 40, he had to check that timer again. Years spent training, Izuku's body had become near perfect as he reached peak human condition. It had felt weird at first, years passing as he felt his body change yet not age a single day. He compared it to a very old American comic he had found, about a weak man given a special drug and was instantly strengthened to the limits of the human body. Izuku's gained muscle mass condensed instead of piling on, resulting in a more lean frame. Izuku had stopped getting taller and was now about a head above Aurora. This was another reason Izuku never stopped training. As long as the time on Earth was paused, he had a limitless capacity to get stronger. Aurora was holding back on her speed to keep the match fair, but her control was slipping in her excitement. Izuku knew that she had no reason to worry about holding back normally, as everyone else she knew was ridiculously strong. The fact that she tried for his sake showed how kind she was. The workaholic part of his brain was happy with the intense training too. "Hey Izuku?" Aurora asked as she spiked the ball, using definitely too much force. Izuku's eyes widened, and he ducked as the ball slammed into the violet ground and rebounded where his head was. "Yeah? I'm not getting that ball by the way," Izuku added as he watched the projectile zoom away. There was no way he was looking for where that landed. Aurora rolled her eyes, creating another ball of light in her palm. They had started out using normal tennis balls, but the equipment always ended up exploding from the force. Izuku blamed Aurora completely. "Have you ever thought about traveling?" Aurora asked out of nowhere. "Aren't you not allowed to take me to any other world other than Earth?" Izuku said, confused. Aurora nodded. Yes, but I can take you to anywhere on Earth with teleportation magic if you have a reference. I can always sense you, Izuku, so you won't have to worry about me ever losing you while you explore. Izuku had looked around the Shizuoka prefecture and other cities around Japan in his search for libraries. However, since there was no one to fly him, he hadn't left the country. Learning to fly an airplane wasn't something Izuku was interested in and was far down on his to-do list. But this was the perfect chance to tour his home. He grinned. Let me show you exactly why we humans love this place. Aurora smiled back, eyes glittering. I look forward to it. Then she launched the ball at his face again without warning. 2298. Europe was beautiful. Izuku, armed with the internet and too much time, picked all the best cities. It was pretty much a tourist dream. No crowds, no spending on anything. Aurora was there once a week to marvel at the view with him. Izuku spent the rest of the time reading and learning new languages. Even when he now knew Japanese, German, Spanish, and English, French was hard. Izuku stayed in hotels. Without people though, the empty buildings made him feel so lonely that he made sure he was constantly reading or training. Was this what the rest of humanity felt when they were sent away? The feeling of being far away from what you call home? He was brought out of his thoughts by a familiar flash of light, as Aurora teleported into his hotel room. While his clothing taste had gotten slightly better from meeting someone frequently, hers had been drastically influenced by her time spent on Earth. Aurora was wearing a red dress that was simplistic in design but suited her completely. She had been growing out her hair, and it now fell to her shoulders. The stars unique to her eyes seemed to be sparkling, and she wore an excited smile at what he could have planned. She was beautiful. Aurora blushed, the pink contrasting with her purple eyes. Ah, Izuku must have said that out loud. Did you wait long? Aurora asked, recovering. She held out her hand. Izuku smiled, taking it. Not really, I was just thinking. So what's the place you wanted to show me? Izuku pictured the city in his mind, the one that had amazed him in the brochure. It's a surprise. Izuku opened his eyes as they reappeared, high up. So where our Aurora started and then cut off. Izuku saw why a moment later. There was no one to maintain electricity, but with time stopped on Earth, light bulbs essentially had infinite power. Izuku had never been so glad for it until now. The view of Paris from the Eiffel Tower was breathtaking. A seemingly endless amount of lights spread outward below him, buildings flashing and roads visible like paths filled with stationary cars. It finally struck him now that this was the exact definition of a date, but for some reason that fact didn't bother him at all. I take back every bad thing I've ever said about Earth, Aurora said breathlessly, breaking the stunned silence. Her eyes were wide as she took in the sight. Izuku chuckled lightly at her reaction as they stood there together. The realization slowly set in as he watched Aurora happily point out what she could see. He loved her. By human standards, Izuku was ridiculously dense. Izuku had known her for at least 50 years, already half of a human's lifespan. When he looked back on it, Izuku was meeting someone once a week, usually at a beach or restaurant. They were basically dating already, only not romantically. Today was a major example, dressing up to show her the view in Paris of all things. By divine standards, Izuku was realizing his feelings too early? From what he knew, gods had incredibly high lifespans. A mere 50 years was probably not much to her. Izuku didn't actually know how old Aurora was, since he figured it would be pretty rude to ask. Izuku had no idea how divine beings dated anyway. Another question was why. Izuku had read enough shoujo manga to know that love just happened. But Aurora was the only person he had to talk to. Was he falling for her just because there was no one else? Aurora deserved better than that. His long-buried self-discouragement showed itself for the first time in decades. Izuku didn't have a complete understanding of his feelings. He wasn't enough. He let out a fond smile as he lifted her hand, pointing out his favorite parts of the view. Izuku had time. 2323. Izuku knew he had loved analyzing, especially quirks. Before the drift, he figured it would be easier to think of the event with a name. Now, Izuku has an incredibly faint memory of superpowers quirks. The only two heroes he knew of were All Might and Present Mic, and he had broken down their quirks long ago. Izuku's ability to analyze things had instead developed into an intense drive to learn and adapt. Most of this was spent training his martial arts, or whatever new thing he found interesting to try. At the point where he had an incredible understanding of divinity, Izuku focused on developing his own staff techniques. What he had the most time analyzing through was Aurora's magic. It made sense, as a goddess she must have countless years to practice. A simple name like light magic just didn't seem to fit in with the notebook's worth of things she was capable of. Just when Izuku thought he had seen everything, she would absorb the brightness from the nearby streetlight into her hair as she complained about a headache. So today, when Aurora said she had something magical to show him, he wasn't surprised. Excited yet worried, "Yes. Why are we in a football stadium?" Izuku asked. "For the space. Plus, this was the closest thing to an arena nearby." Aurora answered, excited as her arms gestured wide at the stadium. They used to spar on Dagoba Beach, but that changed once they started traveling. Since they no longer had a fixed location, Aurora just chose clearings or wide areas for their practice. It wasn't like there was anyone to complain. "So we're going to fight?" Izuku said, preparing himself. "Well, we're not going to fight," Aurora intoned, a strange expression forming on her face. Izuku didn't like that smile very much. She raised her hands, and then closed her eyes in concentration. Nothing seemed to happen at first, but then something began to form. Violet light condensed before gradually taking shape. Izuku could make out claws and strong limbs connecting to a lion's body. But then wings formed out of the creature's back, along with a deadly-looking tail. The creature moved to Aurora's side, alive, coming up to her shoulders even on all fours. Izuku faintly remembered the creature from ancient human mythology. A manticore, a beast with a lion's body, yet also wings and a venomous tail. "You can create creatures. That's amazing!" Izuku exclaimed, awed. She just made a being out of nothing. Aurora grinned, clearly enjoying the praise. "Using your advice, I figured it out. My light can replicate life as long as I understand it." Aurora opened her palm, focusing. After a few seconds, a pigeon formed, before flying away and dissipating. Just as Izuku was growing and adapting, so was she. "So where did you see a manticore?" Izuku asked, curious. Aurora launches into a story about witnessing a battle between a manticore and a pro-hero on a forest planet. The hero apparently had some kind of earth manipulation quirk, and was able to contain the beast's flames and bury it. Aurora was able to visit other planets to help with magical-related issues as part of the Council of Light. Izuku thought that sounded extremely important, but she brushed it off as simply her job. Currently she was monitoring Earth, and he saw her every Saturday. She couldn't take him to any other planets, something that infuriated her. Decades ago, the goddess hesitated from bringing up stories of worlds other than the god's realm. But she understood that it didn't affect him anymore. Izuku had accepted that he would not see anyone else for quite some time. His current life, months passing in an instant with training and weekly conversations, were all he really remembered. And Izuku enjoyed his current life. That didn't mean he didn't enjoy hearing about other worlds. Or wasn't lonely. "So can you make sentient life?" Izuku suddenly said. Aurora frowned. "Not yet. Right now, they only follow my commands, although they might have basic intelligence." Izuku felt a small pang of disappointment, but not as much as he expected. It would have been really weird anyway to ask her to make people for him to talk to. He looked at the manticore, who had been still during their conversation. "So when are we going to dash?" Izuku was cut off as the manticore leapt at him, claws flashing. Reflexes kicking in, he leapt backward as the creature landed where he was, unslinging his trusty staff from his back in a fluid movement. "How rude." "Begin!" Aurora yelled with a wide grin, as if the manticore hadn't already started trying to kill him. Izuku was mainly on the defensive, dodging and parrying the manticore's claws and jaws. Manticores could breathe fire, but since it was a light replica, the beast instead emitted a burst of violet light that was similar to Aurora's own attacks. All of this combined with the tail whipping and stabbing at him, and a manticore was quite deadly. But it was just too slow. Or more accurately, Izuku was too fast for it. Izuku moved gracefully, dodging the attacks with skill born from years of experience. The light beams were the easiest to dodge, reminding him of his spars with Aurora. Izuku's raw speed was more than enough for the tail to fly harmlessly past him, and claws were deflected before they could reach him. The manticore almost seemed to be getting frustrated, if that was possible for a light creature. Finally, the beast made a desperate lunge, jaws wide as it reached for him. In a smooth moment, Izuku twisted and the beast passed him yet again. But this time, he counterattacked. He breathed in, focusing his strength into his arms as he moved into the familiar stance. Stance 2. Izuku swung his staff in an arc with all of his force and slamming into the beast's jaw. Bash! The manticore shattered, breaking into light fragments that dissolved into the air. Izuku grinned, the familiar feeling of accomplishment rising up. He hadn't ever sparred with anyone other than Aurora, and although he sometimes beat her, she never went all out. This was a pure fight, that he won. Furthermore, his technique worked. His created stances seemed to be worth the years of practice. Can I fight it again? Izuku pleaded. 2346. Izuku's hair was turning white. He didn't realize at first. There wasn't much point in caring too much how he looked when there was almost no one to see him. Izuku wasn't exactly a very social person in general either. At least, that's what he assumed. Izuku couldn't really remember what his life was like before the drift. He did know he was quirkless, and with an invisible quirk he was definitely bullied. There wasn't a single trace of him ever knowing a close friend either. So Izuku, being the antisocial, unfashionable person that he was, didn't notice his hair color until he saw his reflection in a store window. Izuku's hair was still mostly green. However, a decent portion was now white, creeping in like snow. Nothing else seemed to be different. His eyes were still green, giving him an interesting contrast. He opened his phone to check the year counter he made and was shocked. Izuku had been abandoned by humanity for over a century. Aurora was confused when he brought it up to her. Don't humans end up with white hair after many years? Yes, because we get old. But I'm not supposed to age, right? Izuku asked, his worry leaking into his voice. Was he dying? Izuku didn't feel like he was aging. His body and mind were still in ideal condition as he continued to train. Maybe he didn't notice he was getting older biologically because of Earth being paused? You don't age right now, Aurora stated calmly, shutting down his spiral. It's probably the effects of living and training this long on your body. I mean, no human has been suspended in time before, not to mention for such an extended period of time. Aurora tilted her head in thought. I could try scanning you if you wanted? Using her magic to scan creatures allowed her to use a blueprint to see how to recreate them. By extension, Aurora would know if something was happening to him. Izuku nodded. The familiar light beamed over him, but unlike her attacks, it didn't hurt at all. Instead, it felt warm, almost like a hug. Aurora smiled when she ended her light show. Nothing's wrong. You're still Izuku Midoriya, just with whitish hair. Also, it kind of looks better this way, Aurora added, leaning back on the couch. Aurora missed Izuku's slight blush at the comment. She made something that worried him seem so simple. Izuku realized that until then, it hadn't fully clicked that he wasn't aging. But this meant he really did have time. Time to get stronger, learn whatever he wanted. Whatever he wanted. Hey Aurora? Yeah, she responded, turning towards him. Is it possible for me to learn magic? Izuku asked. Aurora just stared at him, eyes wide. He knew it was a dumb quest. You mean that you've watched me use magic constantly, for a century, and you're asking now, she asked, incredulous. Izuku scratched his head awkwardly, a bit embarrassed by her reaction. Well, you talked about how the magic you could learn was based on your quirk. Since I'm quirkless, Izuku trailed off. Suddenly, Aurora grabbed his hands, focusing. Used to her bursts of inspiration, he waited. Soon Izuku felt the same feeling run through him from earlier as she scanned him briefly before opening her eyes. Your body has the capacity for reinforcement magic, Aurora said. But you're right, you don't have magic circuits yourself. Aurora grinned. So I'll give you some, she continued, beaming. But I'll warn you, it'll probably hurt. Are you sure you want me to do it? Izuku didn't bother asking if she could do it. The confident smile told him everything. How could he say no to having magic? Aurora wouldn't have mentioned it if it could kill him. I trust you, Izuku answered easily. For some reason, this caused her cheeks to take on a pink tint. Maybe she was tired? Aurora held his hands again, breaking him out of his thoughts, and he braced himself. For a second, there was blinding pain. It was like being electrocuted from the inside of his body, feeling every part of him cry out. And then it ended as soon as it started. Izuku lifted his hands, looking at them. Nothing seemed different, but he could feel the energy under his skin, completely calm compared to a moment ago. When he concentrated, a violet spark formed on his fingers. Izuku lifted his gaze to Aurora to thank her, but found her passed out. A lazy smile filled her face as she lay on the couch. She really did so much for him. Izuku reached over to wake her. It was late and she probably needed to go back. Then he paused. Checking the time, there were still a few hours left. It would be fine if he let her sleep a little longer. 2402. Izuku loved magic. Since Aurora had the same kind of magic circuits, it was easy for him to learn by example. It helped that reinforcement was simple as well. To enhance an object, Izuku focused the new power running through his body into a steady flow. The magic passed into the object he was touching, increasing its durability and power. Izuku just needed to understand the structure of whatever he was reinforcing. His reinforcement flowed out of him, so it couldn't be used to enhance himself. However, since Izuku fought with a weapon, it was perfect. Within a year, Izuku had enough control to enhance his trusty staff as well as the practice to sustain it in combat. His spars with Aurora started to intensify now that when he whacked her with a stick, it actually did something. Humanity was given 5 years to develop their new abilities and get used to the idea of monsters. Now that Izuku finally had his own powers, he threw himself into training them. Every time he used his magic, his total mana rose along with how powerful the enhancement was. Izuku needed enough mana to completely work through whatever was being enhanced. For example, using his magic on a building took a lot of effort and concentration when he started practicing, but within 5 years he had enough mana to do so easily. Izuku found that it was far harder to flow mana into non-solids. According to Aurora, the amount of time Izuku had put into it was already more than any creature before. No one had tried to use it on anything other than weapons. It took another decade to make progress, but Izuku was patient, excited. 10 years wasn't anything to him at this point anyway. Reinforcing liquids was incredibly interesting once he managed it. He practiced on the ocean, mana moving from his bare feet into the ocean, water becoming more solid as he worked. With concentration, Izuku could walk on water freely, manipulating its shape as long as he was in contact. With just a bit of effort, he seemingly had an entirely separate ability, controlling water. Just how far could Izuku develop this ability? 2453. Izuku's life had fallen into a routine. Maybe that was just how he lived, or it was his human mind adapting to living far longer than normal. He always woke up at the same time, going through the morning on almost pure muscle memory. The ache of eating alone most of the week never truly faded, but Izuku rarely noticed it now. Training made him feel alive, the familiar feeling of using up everything he had bliss. Every year he added to the physical training as his body adapted, and going through the regime was something he knew as well as breathing. Izuku loved sparring with Aurora. She didn't need to hold back anymore and could unleash the full force of her magic on him, her rainbow leaving giant craters in the sand. Today was a Saturday. She would arrive soon. He didn't have any other friends to reference, but he did know how happy she made him every week. Izuku was happy with what they had, a comfortable friendship that made him feel like all the centuries were worth it. So he wouldn't risk telling her, ruining whatever they had. Aurora was too kind to push him away for something so simple, but the fact was that he knew nothing about divine courtship. She might not even consider dating a human. There was also the reality that his romantic experiences merely consisted of 100 years of shoujo manga. Izuku made the choice to put off his confession for another year. He was great at the long game after all. Izuku heard the familiar snap behind him. He felt a small smile rise up on his face as he once again turned to greet Aurora. Then Izuku froze in complete confusion. On the sand in front of him was a woman he had never seen before, which didn't exactly mean much, since Izuku only knew one person. The feeling of power radiating off of her was almost tangible though, and reminded him of Aurora. Izuku guessed she was a goddess. Besides her aura, she seemed completely different from his companion. While Aurora's hair was long and purple, hers was short and blonde. She wore a simple yet beautiful thin piece of red armor, made of some flexible metal he couldn't name. Izuku couldn't read the symbols adorned on it. Her red eyes seemed to stare right through him, and as he watched, they narrowed into a powerful glare. Staring was rude, right? Izuku Midoriya? She said, less of a question and more of a statement. Yes? Izuku nodded, confused. Sekmet? Sekmet responded simply. Her right hand lifted slowly, tightening into a fist. Let's fight. It wasn't a question but an order. Sekmet's voice wasn't cruel, but low and powerful, akin to a commander. Slowly, her words began to set in. Izuku blinked, utterly lost. Wadash. Sekmet blurred forward, almost faster than he could comprehend. Thankfully, years of practice kicked in and he crossed his arms, just in time to block her fist. Izuku felt the blow throughout his entire body, the impact sending him tumbling across the sand like a ragdoll. He came to a stop 100 meters away. Izuku caught a flicker in the corner of his eyes and immediately rolled to the side, a vicious axe kick carving into his spot where he was. His eyes widened. The pure physical strength eclipsed his own easily. Sekmet kept up her offense, a powerful series of punches and kicks that took all of his concentration to even keep up with. The fight felt almost like a dance. Every move she made was perfectly calculated, not a single bit of energy wasted. He ducked under a kick, but there was already a punch heading his way. Izuku lashed out, but she was already behind him. Sekmet was always one step ahead. But he could adapt. Apologizing to his stomach in advance, he stepped into her next punch. It was easier when he was prepared for it, but it still hurt like hell. Wincing, Izuku's next strike intentionally swung too wide, missing completely. But as Sekmet started to respond, Izuku twisted, grabbing his staff from his back and swinging in one fluid movement. Stance 1. Sweep. His trusty weapon moved in a low arc, far faster than any attack he used before. The metal struck her ankle with every bit of his strength before she could react. She didn't fall, but the power behind the attack forced her to stumble, off balance. An opening. Izuku lunged forward, aiming for her jaw, but Sekmet was already recovering. At inhuman speeds, she caught the blow and countered with a palm strike, landing a direct hit to his chest. The breath was knocked out of him completely, and he could feel something crack as he fell backwards onto the beach. Were those his ribs? That probably wasn't very good. Izuku took a moment to catch his breath, panting. Everything seemed to hurt, and his arms ached as he gripped his staff to stand up. Izuku felt a grin come onto his face despite the pain, pure joy at such a challenging fight. Aurora was an excellent fighter, but she mainly fought with magic at long distances. Sekmet, on the other hand, fought with pure hand-to-hand abilities, exactly like him. She used the divinity style as well, but instead of mixing in other combat forms, Sekmet seemed to have mastered divinity alone and pushed it to its furthest point. She wasn't using any magic, probably to hold herself back, and wasn't that a terrifying thought? Izuku struggled to his feet, swaying but ready, his weight supported by the cool metal of his staff. Sekmet waited for him to stand, patient. He couldn't read her expression very well, but he thought that there was something akin to approval in her eyes when he finally stood up. So this must be a test of some sort. Izuku had no idea what the trial was, but naturally he would do his best to meet it. And that meant using everything he had. Reaching out with his free hand, Izuku concentrated, mana flowing from his palm into the air. The space around him tinted purple as the reinforcement took effect. 10 violet chains began to solidify, outlined by his mana, surrounding his enemy. If liquids could be manipulated, then why not gases? Reinforcing the atmosphere was incredibly difficult, flowing mana through air was slippery. But if Izuku was anything, it was patient, and now it was paying off. Izuku clenched his fist and his chains responded, 9 of them enveloping Sekmet like an angry blanket in an instant. Knowing this wouldn't hold her for long, he blitzed forward, muscles screaming in protest. Izuku condensed the wind surrounding him into a whip, lashing it at her. Sekmet broke through the chains instantly, sidestepping the wind whip gracefully. Izuku stayed out of her range, whips striking from all sides. She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed, then she moved, faster than Izuku could see. He jumped back on instinct, and the kick missed his face by inches. She attacked and they fell into rhythm again, but now Izuku could feel himself slowing down. Her next punch cut into his cheek as he dodged, his next block almost making him lose his grip on the staff. He was completely exhausted, but from her movements, Sekmet was barely breaking a sweat. Izuku played his last card, wrapping her ankle with the final air chain. With all of his remaining strength, he swung the chain wide, launching Sekmet into the ocean. Izuku caught her expression finally changing, eyes widening in pure surprise as she landed with a splash far away from the shore. Izuku rushed to the water before she could surface and took a deep breath. In the next second, a giant amount of sea water turned solid. Sekmet was trapped. In the absence of waves crashing onto the shore, everything was silent. Izuku felt the headache piercing his mind from the mana usage, but gritted his teeth and maintained it. Izuku just needed to hold her until an ear-splitting crack echoed around the beach as the ocean shattered, breaking him out of his thoughts. Sekmet leapt out of the water easily, crashing into the sand in front of him. Without a pause, she charged once more. Another hour passed of fierce combat, until Izuku finally ran out of stamina. He fell backwards onto the sand. He knew his limit, and he had gone far past it. He let go of his staff, letting it rest in the sand beside him, letting out a raspy breath that almost became a cough. His injuries were ridiculous, he would probably be screaming when the adrenaline faded. His arms were in pretty bad shape and it was hard to breathe. Izuku doubted he could stand, and he had spent all of his mana. Sekmet looked down at him, then to his surprise, nodded in approval. "Good fight. Thanks," Izuku said, confused. The edges of his vision were slowly turning black. Was he going to die? As if reading his thoughts, Sekmet snapped her fingers. Now, Izuku did scream as his bones remended and his broken body stitched up. It hurt just as much as being wrecked in the first place. But Izuku did feel a bit better as the pain started to recede. The exhaustion, unfortunately, stayed. Ignoring him, Sekmet pulled a small, circular device out of her pocket, vaguely futuristic. She tapped it, and Izuku realized it was for communication when seconds later, a responding snap sounded on the beach. Aurora arrived, hair shimmering in the evening light. Izuku absently noticed the sun was setting, and wondered just how long he had spent being beat to a pulp. She looked to him first, her eyebrows scrunched together in concern. Izuku stared back. Their silent conversation was short, and Aurora's gaze turned softer for a moment. Then the tender expression was gone as her head whipped around to glare at Sekmet. "Why have you come, sister?" Aurora asked, though it sounded more like an accusation than a question. Her beautiful eyes darkened. In contrast to Aurora, Sekmet was completely impassive, her face not giving anything away. "I needed to test him," Sekmet stated simply, already turning to leave. "Besides, the human passed. And he's clearly alive." The last statement was thrown his way casually, with a short glance. So Izuku had been right, she had been testing him. With that, Sekmet vanished in a burst of red light. One day, Izuku was going to figure out how to do the teleport thing, and getting around would be much easier. Izuku stared at the spot where the blonde goddess had stood for a moment as he still laid unmoving on the sand. He sighed. "Of course, the first new person I meet after centuries tries to kill me." Aurora laughed, a bright sound that filled the silent beach. Izuku felt lighter somehow, despite how heavy his eyelids felt. She sat down next to him on the sand. "To be fair, I've tried to kill you too, Izuku," Aurora responded, eyes twinkling. Izuku turned his head towards her, slightly confused. Aurora was beaming, a wide smile stretching across her face. This was the happiest he'd seen her. Well yeah, but that was completely different, Izuku said, his own smile forming just from being near her. Izuku loved fighting. It is part of who he is. He wasn't scared of being injured or broken. But Izuku was scared of death. There were so many things he still wanted to do. He wanted to see humanity return. He wanted to improve himself. He wanted to spend time with Aurora. With so much time, suddenly losing all of it was a horrifying thought. He pushed away the turn his thoughts had taken. It didn't help that the adrenaline had faded, leaving his tired body completely spent. Izuku blinked, feeling his head resting on something far more comfortable than the rough sand. Aurora looked down at him, expression impossibly soft. She stroked his hair back, now completely white, he hadn't even realized. He should be embarrassed, but Izuku felt so tired, and laying in her lap he didn't need to force himself to stay awake. Besides, she would probably have to leave soon anyway, his traitorous mind reasoned. So Izuku let go, feeling everything fade away. Izuku was used to waking up almost everywhere. It was rare that he slept in his bed, usually falling asleep wherever he ended up. His poor spine had adapted to couches, libraries, research labs, and dojos. There had been too many times where he was too lazy to make it to a hotel and just laid a pillow onto the cold street. He couldn't remember waking up to another person. Reasonably, he would have been woken up by his mother before humanity vanished, but it was so long ago. So when Izuku opened his eyes the day after meeting Sekmet, he thought he was dreaming. His head was still resting on Aurora's knee, and she was watching the sun rise, orange light across her face with the feeling of being content almost radiating off of her. This was real. He must have shifted, because Aurora turned to look down at him. There were so many things he wanted to ask. Was he still in her lap? Oh gods, had she been here the entire night? But when he tried to put it all into words, what came out was a breathless how. You passed, remember? Aurora asked. Izuku's eyes widened. The trial? Sekmet is the strongest. Holding out that long against her means that you are considered to be on the level of a god, despite being human. Sorth no longer needs a messenger to keep heaven updated. Aurora was proud, Izuku realized. Of him. Heaven no longer needed a messenger. Aurora didn't need to report to heaven every week, and leave at the end of every Saturday. Aurora could. Does this mean you can stay? Izuku couldn't help asking, hoping. Aurora's smile widened, reminding him of yesterday when he wondered just what had made her so happy. This time though he understood why. Izuku felt the exact same. I will. They watched the sunrise together, for the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Then the peaceful silence broke. Wait, that was your sister? 2532. Izuku knew how fast time passed, how minutes and hours and days went by in a blur. Before, he saw every day as either a Saturday or not one. When he was alone, with his training, thoughts, and books, the weeks just happened as he looked forward to the next time he got to see Aurora. Now, everything was different. Izuku hadn't lived with anyone in centuries, and it was a pleasant change. He was used to silence. But it was so much better having someone at the otherwise empty table to share his cooking with and relate to. The old ache of loneliness lessened like a healing scar. Izuku set up his guest room for her. It must have been smaller than what she was used to in heaven, what were godly homes like. But she bundled into the green blankets happily. Neither of them mentioned the room next to Izuku's, empty but waiting. Izuku didn't go shopping very often, mostly out of guilt at essentially stealing. It wasn't like there was anyone there to give money to. But decorating Aurora's room was a worthy cause, he decided. What surprised Izuku, though, was the color. Everything was a soft green, from the painted walls to the pillows. He should ask if that color was her favorite. They often spent nights on movie marathons, passing out on the couch when it got late. Izuku always fell asleep first, not used to having anyone to stay up for. Every time, he woke up to her asleep on the couch too. They traveled, starting small at first, long walks together around Mizudafu to museums and mountains. Aurora took in his home with pure curiosity, excited in a way that made showing her places like seeing them for the first time. Eventually, they moved onto the world, staying in hotels and exploring before Aurora's magic teleported them to the next spot. Aurora still had her role as a goddess. Izuku definitely wasn't complaining, but it was surprising how they let her work from Earth. Sekmet visited every few months. She brought news from heaven, but mostly trained Izuku and became sort of a terrifying mentor figure. Sparring against her, Izuku improved immensely. It did wonders for his pain tolerance especially. Sekmet came off as cold at first. If Izuku was doing something terribly, she'd tell him. Her compliments were extremely rare, but this just made them more valuable. When she was with her sister, the facade broke slightly. Sekmet was protective of Aurora, yet didn't limit her actions. Izuku recognized that her vouch was probably the main reason Aurora could stay on Earth. While her sister's magic was a warm, free presence, Sekmet's was tightly controlled. Sekmet possessed two types of magic, her mana becoming an enchanting mix. Sekmet healed him often, since he was injured every time they sparred, and he was familiar with the green mana fixing him. Her enhancement magic was different, the red surrounding her like a cloak. It multiplied her physical strength, already at ridiculous levels, to unstoppable. Izuku and Aurora were currently in a popular hotel in America, surrounded by grassy fields. Aurora usually preferred to sleep in, so Izuku trained the most in the morning. Izuku swung his staff a final time, feeling the air burst around him from the pressure. He let the violet sparkling from his staff fade, and slung the cool metal onto his back. Izuku brushed back the hair that had been pushed in his eyes as he looked up at the parted clouds. His hair was completely white now, but to his relief didn't show any signs of falling out. Izuku remembered when it was green, a shade of emerald matching his eyes. He knew what his mom looked like, and the fact that they wouldn't match anymore felt like he lost something. The white suited him better though, long hair falling almost to his shoulders like snow. Maybe he needed to cut it? Izuku was pulled out of his musing by something nudging his foot. Looking down, he was surprised to see a cat pawing him. There were no animals around the paused earth, and he had assumed they were gone with everything else. But in front of him was a small, pitch-black creature proving that otherwise. The cat stared at him with yellow eyes curiously as he bent down to it, but didn't move away. "Hello," Izuku whispered softly. "Do you have a name?" The cat stared at him. "I'll just call you Kuro then. Do you want to come with me?" There was no response, but when Izuku started walking away, Kuro followed him, tail swishing in the grass. Izuku walked into town. Wandering, he picked up pet food that Kuro had stared at along with other things he could think of needing for a cat before leaving the store. He had stopped feeling guilty about taking items long ago. It wasn't like there was anyone around to complain about it. At some point, Kuro had climbed up to his shoulder as he returned to the hotel. The weight was nice, and Izuku didn't need to worry about losing him. Aurora opened her eyes when he shook her awake. "What?" she murmured, sitting up. Her purple hair fell to her shoulders now. He lifted Kuro off his shoulder, holding him out in front of her. "This is Kuro. Can we adopt him?" Aurora blinked slowly, an adorable motion that gave him a familiar twinge. "I don't see why not. Do you know how to take care of him?" Izuku shrugged. "I can probably figure it out. Have you ever had a pet before?" Aurora tilted her head. "Mother gave me a dragon when I was young. They are extremely smart though, so it wasn't much work for me. This cat," Izuku supplied. "Cat seems easy to care for." She glanced at the creature, docile in his hands, purple eyes meeting yellow. "But Kuro? Really? What? It's a good name." Izuku defended. Maybe naming a black cat black was a little unoriginal. Kuro didn't seem to mind though. Aurora shook her head with an impossibly fond sigh. Izuku put Kuro down, and they watched him explore the hotel room before leaping onto the bed. Aurora gently stroked his black fur. "You know, you didn't have to ask me if you could have a pet, right? Why wouldn't I ask if someone could join our family?" Izuku asked, confused. Aurora's purple eyes widened, and she stared at him for a moment. When she spoke, it was quiet. "You think of me as family?" Izuku paused, feeling the weight behind those words. He was probably overstepping, but when he thought about Aurora, who had always been there. "Of course I do." Aurora smiled, small and genuine and soft, and Izuku felt like he was still outside in the sun. 2536. How does courtship work in heaven? The fists stopped inches from his face, the wind rushing by him and rippling through his hair. What? Sekmet asked flatly. Izuku felt a bit of heat rise in his cheeks. You know, dating y-. Yes, I know what courting is. Sekmet interrupted, then let out a sigh. The park was silent for a moment. This is about Aurora, isn't it? She asked. Izuku's eyes widened, shocked. How did you know? You just confirmed it. Also, you are acquainted with exactly 2 people. One of which is me. He winced. It kind of hurts when you put it like that. Do I look like someone you should come to for romantic advice? The blonde raised an eyebrow. No, but as you so nicely mentioned, I don't really have any other options. Izuku replied dryly. Fair point. Sekmet paused and thought. For gods, it's pretty much the same as with humans. Meet someone, date them, marriage. You're dating, right? Izuku stared at her. No? That's what I wanted to ask you for advice on. Sekmet looked up at the sky. I never thought I would meet someone more dense than I am, she muttered under her breath. What? Haven't you been basically dating for the past few centuries? You're so clearly in love that I could see it. Izuku didn't know what to say to that. He knew that, the thought bugging him for decades, but had it really been that obvious? Anyway, I was in your position once, a long time ago. When I got married. You're married? Izuku broke in, completely shocked. Sekmet glared at him, mana flaring, and he fell into silence instantly. When I got married, I really didn't know how it happened. I'm terrible at this kind of thing, so it took that idiot a long time to get it through to me. She smiled. So you should tell her. I mean, my sister has more emotional knowledge than both of us put together, anyway. Izuku laughed. You know, you seem really tough and closed off. But you're actually super soft and supportive. I'm not soft. Sekmet shot back, but the anger wasn't there. You're like a tsundere. What the hell is a tsundere? Sekmet glared at the blonde girl on screen. I am nothing like this. The blonde got flustered by the main character and covered it up by yelling at him. Nothing. Aurora tilted her head. But what about that one time Kensei-sen got you flowers and you got so embarrassed you dash? That was centuries ago. When you mentioned your husband, you called him a baka, Izuku noted. I'll make your next training session twice as hard. Sekmet promised. What? Why? 3 times? Izuku looked to Aurora for help, but she just laughed. Betrayal. Don't worry, Nei-san, you aren't a normal tsundere. You're evolved. Like a Pokemon? Izuku asked. Like a Pokemon. Aurora agreed. Sekmet glanced between them, lost. What's a Pokemon? So basically, a young child is given a familiar and is sent out to fight monsters, and strangers, given 0 training? Izuku shrugged. I guess. The creatures are cute though. Aurora piped up from the couch. Sekmet looked down at the device. It still seems stupid though. I don't know why anyone would ever play this. So which starter do I pick? I can't believe you're addicted to Pokemon. I'm not addicted. I don't know why you two think that. Nei-san, it's been 6 hours. This is a masterpiece of tactical warfare, with a deceptively adorable art style. The strategy required is extraordinary. Me and my Bulbasaur will fight on forever. Look at what you did, Izuku. She's corrupted. It's not that bad. Sekmet grinned as she completed yet another gym on the first try. I'm a gamer now. Oh gods. Yes? Aurora asked. Yes? Sekmet asked, face buried in the game. Izuku sighed. He had brought this upon himself. 2537. A date in Paris, where their first date was, though he doubted she remembered, then a confession on top of the tower. Yes, that was the culmination of Izuku and Sekmet's romantic knowledge. The plan was incredibly simple, and there was no way it could go wrong. Unless Aurora rejected him, and then he would die inside and she would leave and then he would be alone. Izuku paused in his spiral. Aurora was the kindest person he knew. If she said no, it would be gentle, and there was no way she would abandon him for something like this. Izuku stood in his black and green suit, probably the most formal thing he had, a white scarf hugging his neck. Petting Kuro for good luck, he walked out the door, ready. Aurora was already in the hotel lobby when he came down, greeting him with a smile. She was wearing a gorgeous purple dress, a fabric he couldn't name, making it seem ethereal with swirling blue designs. Her hair was styled differently today, making her look like a queen. Never mind, he might just die here. You look beautiful, Izuku said breathlessly. Aurora smiled, a faint blush on her cheeks. You look great too, Izuku. So where are we going? Aurora asked. Gods had the ability to teleport long distances, using up stamina to travel across worlds in an instant. However, this meant that Izuku couldn't surprise Aurora unless it was within walking distance. Right on cue, Sekmet arrived behind them and put a hand on their backs, warping them away. They landed with a snap, traveling from America to France in an instant. Sekmet immediately vanished, though with a last glance at Izuku, you better not mess this up. Aurora's eyes widened, and Izuku grinned. This is Paris? How did you get Sekmet to help? Izuku shrugged. He really did owe her one for helping him. Or three. Izuku smiled, offering Aurora his hand. She took it and they walked. The winter air was chilly, and Izuku was happy he brought his scarf. Sometimes he wished he was immune to the cold, like Aurora was. Izuku could remember watching her walk through the snow in a t-shirt. Aurora's hand was warm in his though. They hadn't been in Paris in decades, and Izuku was questioning that now. The city was amazing, bright lights illuminating the streets. They spent the evening like that, pointing out sights to each other. They ate a bento on the bridge, watching the river. The conversation flowed, and they talked about anything and everything. He was spending time with her, but now the atmosphere was charged. She laughed, and instead of laughing with her, Izuku's breath caught watching her. When Aurora realized they were going to the tower, she grinned and he almost fell. Gods, he was a mess. There was a peaceful silence on top of the tower, and Izuku remembered that date centuries ago. He had given himself time to see if it was a mistake, if he was just latching onto the first person he had met who was kind to him. Time to see if Izuku had a chance. That time had passed though. It was easy to push it off for months and years and decades and centuries. Izuku looked at her. Aurora was radiant, a wide smile still on her face as she watched the city below. He loved her. Hey Aurora? Aurora turned to him. Marry me. Wait, that wasn't what? And then she was kissing him, something impossibly soft and an answer all on its own. Sure, Aurora replied, breathlessly, seconds later. Well then. So, how did it go? It went amazing. But then we got on the tower, and I didn't tell her I loved her dash. You actual idiot. You had one job. What? But instead asked her to marry me dash. What? And then she said yes dash. Sekmet blinked. What? And then we kissed. Sekmet stared at him. I owe you like 5 favors. Izuku said. This is what happens when you send an overachiever on a date, isn't it? Izuku shrugged. Sekmet's eyes hardened, and Izuku suddenly felt an immense amount of pressure bearing down on him. It was like gravity was multiplied. Her red eyes glowed, and mana flooded the area. You know that if you hurt her, I'll destroy you, right? Then I'll heal you and crush you again. Izuku nodded. Of course. The killing intent vanished, and Izuku took a deep breath. Good answer. There was a pause. You have to teach me that someday. Teach you what? 2540. Are you sure? Aurora asked. Izuku nodded. I want to meet her. Aurora bit her lip. We don't have to get her blessing. We have Sekmet as a witness, and Kensei-sen can legally marry us. Aurora, did she raise you? Do you care about her? Yes. Then I have to meet her, right? Izuku asked. Aurora sighed. I do love her, but she's a lot, and she's scary dash. She was worried about him, Izuku realized. Her eyes were wide, and hands shaking so slightly he wouldn't have noticed if he didn't look for it. Aurora was so strong, yet she was scared of losing him. He knew how that felt. Izuku smiled, gently picking up both her hands, holding them in his own. Your mother is probably terrifying, but I'll survive. And she could never scare me off from you. Izuku, my mother is the queen of heaven. Oh fuck. Sekmet, out of curiosity, what are my chances of beating the queen of heaven? 0%, she answered immediately. Izuku winced. Yeah, that's what I thought. If it makes you feel any better, I'll delete your internet browsing history if you die. Thanks, Sekmet. The first thing that hit him was the color. Heaven was vibrant, the world around him incredible in detail. It was almost like he was in a dream, the woods they landed in so similar to what he knew but with amazing definition. His other senses caught up soon after, leaves rustling and a stream somewhere nearby. He could feel everything around him, his mana branching out like it was coming home. Izuku saw Aurora smile at him from the corner of his eye, probably from his reaction. He felt the familiar urge to adventure, to explore. She understood, taking his hand in hers, and they walked out of the forest. Izuku didn't know what he had expected, maybe a futuristic sea of lights and skyscrapers, or a hall of golden towers. Instead, heaven was more familiar. The buildings were traditional, something he could almost call Japanese. But the intricate details spoke of centuries and centuries of construction. Looking around, Izuku could see things that he would probably never understand. Holograms walked around, carrying sentient conversation as they advertised products, and some kind of entertainment device was being held by a group of children. Of course, beings with a long lifespan would be far ahead in technology. Aurora, do gods have flying cars? Izuku asked, a bit of excitement leaking into his voice. Aurora laughed at the mental image. We teleported here, didn't we? Easiest way to travel. Some gods can fly under their own power though. Izuku's eyes widened. You can fly. Aurora's smile faltered ever so slightly. I wish. But no. Few have the ability to do so. Izuku wondered if there was more to it, but didn't push her. They began to merge with the crowd. He knew, of course, that there would be other gods. This was a whole realm, one that hadn't all been whisked away. Cities were supposedly filled with people. But it was still so strange seeing so many people walking near him, talking, living. It wasn't too crowded, but there were presences all around him, and he felt the sounds start to be smothering. The many conversations filling around him were quiet, but together it was like he was trapped in a sea of strangers. Aurora didn't say anything, but she squeezed his hand in support. He took a deep breath, letting all the voices and footsteps and noise wash over him like a river. Thanks. Izuku breathed. Anytime. Aurora said simply, like she wasn't anchoring him to reality. They got some strange glances, but nobody approached them. Izuku wasn't surprised people stopped to stare at him, but the reverent looks Aurora received confused him. Then Izuku remembered Aurora was an actual princess. He was brought out of thought as they approached something that could only be described as a palace. If he didn't know this was it from the architectural masterpiece in front of his eyes, the slight stiffening of Aurora's shoulders and the unmistakable feel of power made it clear. The guards didn't stop them, obviously informed they were coming. When they reached the office though, Aurora stopped outside the door. I can't go further than this, she sent for you alone. Aurora's voice was calm, determined. Only from centuries of knowing her could he hear the change in tone, the worry. Izuku pulled her in for a kiss. Chaste, he wasn't trying to be killed before he even walked in. He watched the adorable furrow of her eyebrow lighten, a small blush at the unexpected affection. He grinned at her before turning to opening the door. It closed behind him, royal purple mana sewing shut like a gap in reality. Izuku looked around the office, taking in the surprisingly homely room of couches and photos. Izuku hadn't ever had a job before, but this workspace felt like a home instead of work. Before he could look closer, a woman stood up from the desk. Her hair was silver, and she wore a simple blue kimono unexpected of someone ruling a realm. Hello, Queen. Izuku started respectfully. A faint smile curved into her jaded features at the title. Please, just call me Amaterasu. Have a seat. She gestured to the couches, and he sat across from her. It was ridiculously soft, and if Izuku wasn't so terrified he might have fallen asleep. Izuku nodded, and felt the fabric of reality shift in front of him. Instantly, there were 2 teacups on the wood table. He took his, carefully sipping. It was delicious and calming, the technique obviously developed over an incredibly long time. Amaterasu's posture was regal, sharp gray eyes cutting through him. Hospitality's over, the kind host he just saw slowly began to recede, and the feel of her mana laced the room like increased gravity. "Sekmet said you requested a meeting with me," Amaterasu stated. "Why?" "I wanted to talk to you about Aurora." She tilted her head slightly. "Is this about the engagement?" Izuku blinked. "You know, of course, everyone's heard about it by now. A human marrying a god is exceptionally rare, and something like your case hasn't ever happened before. I am surprised you told me though. Why wouldn't I? I'm not completely omniscient. Of course, I could obliterate you before you could even blink." Izuku's hands twitched, the threat said with absolute certainty without pause. "But I wouldn't be able to stop the wedding if you chose to hide it from me." "Did you tell me out of respect?" Amaterasu asked. "Amaterasu-sama, if I marry Aurora you would be family." She raised a perfect eyebrow. "I would. Aurora doesn't mention you often, but I can tell how much your opinion affects her. She cares about you. That makes your approval important to me as well," Izuku said, meeting her eyes. Amaterasu stared at him for a moment. "I see why there is so much talk about you now. You are unique for a human." "Thanks." He wondered what the rumors were. It was weird to consider a bunch of people he had never met knowing about him. "You certainly deserve a chance, so I'll give you a test." Amaterasu stood, and everything shifted. The office was replaced with a completely empty, smaller room. The walls and floor were clouds, somehow solid. At the center was a mass of royal purple energy that Izuku now recognized as Amaterasu's mana, supporting something obscured by fluffy clouds. "I have something to take care of, so in the meantime I need you to hold that. Support it for a few minutes till I get back, and I'll give you my blessing." "Should be simple." Izuku walked over, putting his hands under the purple barrier. This would surely be difficult, but what were minutes to the centuries he had lived? Izuku placed his staff next to him, and tensed his legs, arms curling in preparation. Amaterasu vanished, and the barrier went with her. Something huge pressed down, threatening to crush him. Izuku pushed back, bringing it to a grudging standstill. A second passed, and then the pain started to hit. After 10 seconds, the burning in his arms was impossible to ignore. Soon, the pain began to spread and every muscle in his body strained. He couldn't spare the effort to look up, but he finally realized what he was carrying. Amaterasu had dropped the fucking sky on him. Izuku stopped counting once a minute passed. His thoughts weren't coherent, beginning to blend, cutting off and swirling into each other. There was only his body screaming to let go, and himself screaming back. Izuku knew the sky was slowly lowering, the ridiculous weight pushing down. But he had no idea how to stop it. Izuku was just a human. A human with 300 years of training, of course, but still a human. He felt blood start to drip from his nose. There was no one around him. For the first time Izuku could remember, time was moving so slowly. Every second he endured felt like another year. How much time had passed? 3 minutes? There was no way he could last. Black was already curling in the edge of his vision. The darkness would take him, Izuku would pass out, turn into a pancake, and then the sky would fall down through the cloud. If he was holding up the sky, the beautiful painting he had stared at for hours and hours until his neck hurt, then he was above Earth. Something this heavy with any velocity crashing into Earth would completely destroy it. Their home. He couldn't let that happen. Izuku sighed, then took a deep breath. His taxed lungs almost made him regret it, but they worked, bringing air into his body. He focused, feeling his mana rushing through his circuits as he had thousands of times before. It was harder than ever, working under literal pressure, but he managed. Izuku flowed mana into the air around his arms, solidifying it. He shaped 2 gauntlets of violet light, surrounding his hands and forearms, as dense as he could make it. Then Izuku gritted his teeth and pushed. Ever so slowly, the sky began to lift. The pain seemed to increase. Izuku couldn't tell if he was screaming or not. The gauntlets had started to crack under the strain, pieces of air breaking off, but it was moving. He was lifting the fucking sky, using every bit of willpower he had. Izuku didn't know how long he stood there. By the time Amaterasu returned, Izuku was completely numb. As soon as he felt the overwhelming force disappear, Izuku let his arms drop to his sides and blacked out. Izuku opened heavy eyes to Aurora's face looking down at him. Sleep well? Great actually. My arms are still dead, but I'm okay. Izuku answered, smiling at her unsaid concern. He sat up from her lap, noticing they were in the queen's office. Hello Izuku, Amaterasu said. Surprisingly, she seemed chastised, like someone had scolded her. You dropped the sky on me, Izuku stated with a bit of uncharacteristic venom. He wasn't the type to hold grudges. Sekmet had attacked him without warning the first time he had met her. That had been a spar though, this had been agony. She what? Aurora's head whipped to her mother's instantly in a powerful glare. Amaterasu nodded, a slight wince under her daughter's fury. Aurora was a powerful force. I needed to know if he could handle my blessing. I thought this was about our marriage. Isn't that what that test was for? Izuku asked, confused. I wasn't testing if you were worthy of my daughter. I already know you are. Izuku's eyes widened. Really? Aurora can marry whoever she wants. But from what I've seen, you make her happy, enough to live in an entirely different realm. And you two trust each other? Amaterasu smiled at Aurora, who was speechless, before turning back to him. I do approve of your marriage. And that's why I'm glad you can take my divine blessing. Thank you, Mother. Aurora said softly. Of course, dear. He's the one who earned it after all. What's a divine blessing? Izuku questioned cautiously. Aurora turned to him, lifting his hand in hers. He could feel their similar magic circuits through her fingers. It's an important thing for us, giving someone your blessing. It drains a lot of mana, and is a sign of trust. I gave you mine when I gifted you magic. But Mother's would essentially turn you into a god. Amaterasu finished. Your body would be stronger and you would truly stop aging. You would also not need explicit permission to visit heaven anymore. Izuku felt a pure smile take over his face as it sunk in. You mean that even when Earth is unfrozen, I won't age? Izuku glanced at his fiancée, seeing his joy mirrored. I could spend forever with her. He very nearly kissed Aurora, but with Amaterasu there settled for crushing her in a hug instead. She returned it, and they separate after a few moments before turning back to the queen. Can we hug you? Izuku asked hesitantly. Amaterasu didn't say anything for a few moments, and he thought he went too far. Then she sighed. Just this once. Izuku pulled her into a grateful hug, and Aurora followed with a grin. If the Queen of Heaven let it go on for longer than needed, well, no one would know. This was the hard part. The easy part is convincing the rest of heaven that Izuku is worthy. He's going to become a prince, after all. Izuku just pushed that thought for later, the idea of him being royalty too weird to think about right now. How do I do that? The arena. When I give you the blessing you'll be knocked out, so you can fight tomorrow once you're rested. If you defeat a powerful competitor in combat, heaven will have to acknowledge you. So I beat some guy up with a stick and they'll think I'm cool? Exactly. Aurora sighed. Izuku shouldn't have to prove anything to them. Amaterasu shrugged. Politics are ridiculous. Aurora met her gaze for a few moments in thought. At least it'll be fun to see their faces when Izuku whacks them. I'll be looking forward to it. With that, Amaterasu placed a hand on his forehead, filling his vision with purple. The arena was the biggest structure Izuku had ever been in. It was similar to a football stadium, yet with a Roman design. The ancient look clashed with how comfortable the seats looked, as well as the holographic billboards displaying views of the field. The arena was almost completely filled, a mass of strangers. Izuku struggled to even process that many people. Thankfully, the stands were high up. Izuku's competition hadn't arrived yet. He could feel his new divine blessing running through his magic circuits, brimming with power. He felt lighter, stronger. His mana capacity had probably risen as well, and he was excited to test it all. On cue, a pillar of flame erupted on the other side of the field, making Izuku shield his eyes. The fire revealed a new figure clad in gleaming golden armor and tan skin, a resting smirk on the man's lips. He was slightly taller than Izuku. All in all, Izuku felt like he was in a movie for a moment. You must be the human. The word was said like a cat person would have mentioned dogs. My name is Izuku. Izuku said diplomatically. Even his limited social skills could sense the attitude radiating off the man in front of him. Agni. Izuku tilted his head. Like agony? Agni grinned, full of teeth. Exactly. He pulled out a long spear from his back, blade shining in the sun. Izuku brushed his white hair from his face, almost feeling underdressed in his t-shirt and pants against a fully equipped god. He lifted his trusty staff, letting his improved mana run through it. His feet spread into the familiar stance. Agni struck first, spear lunging at high speeds at his heart. Izuku twisted, letting the blade rush past him and lashing out with his leg at Agni's side. The kick was blocked, forcing Izuku to leap back as Agni pushed him on the defensive with an array of stabs. Izuku's staff was holding up well, deflecting and striking back, the reinforcement holding strong. He noticed his violet mana was now a darker purple, clashing against the gold of Agni's spear with every parry. Izuku raised the tempo, landing his own strikes against the god. Minutes passed, Izuku only gaining small cuts. But the burning, fiery mana he sensed wasn't being shown at all. Izuku landed a clean punch, aiming towards the unarmored head, and whipped Agni's face back. The returning punch to the gut made him lose his breath. Izuku barely dodged the spear aimed at his head, drawing blood from his cheek. The crowd cheered. Then Izuku started looking closer. The same grin that Izuku finally placed as condescension still looked down at him, flashy thrusts and strikes to do maximum damage yet show off, the mana being held at bay. That's all you got? Agni laughed, the blade of the spear almost reaching Izuku's throat before being batted aside. Agni was making the fight into a game, leading the battle like a play with wide, dramatic strikes and apparent ease. If Izuku, the new prince, was killed here without any mana used with basically all of heaven watching, Agni would get all the recognition a warrior could want and Aurora's name would probably be dragged into the mud. He needed to turn this from a performance into a battle. Stance 6, Javelin. Izuku moved his staff into position, focusing all of his new strength into his arms as he launched it with all his might. The practiced movement was almost supersonic. Izuku twisted the air around the projectile, curling it into a spiral to increase the momentum as it flew. Why? Agni's red eyes widened with satisfying shock. The spear rose to block the missile on reflex, the impact knocking the golden weapon out of his hands as the arm dislocated. The staff went flipping up, into the air with a glint of metal. Izuku tensed his legs and leapt. Stance 7, burst. Everything slowed down, the spear stabbing into the ground, the staff falling, Agni's body attempting to shift into higher gear with not enough time to do so. His arm gradually rose to block, but Izuku was already in front of him, a purple gauntlet of air hardening around his fist as he drove it into Agni's face with everything he had. There was a crash as the man's head was introduced to the ground in a shockwave of force, and with his other hand Izuku caught the falling staff. The crowd was silent, in awe or indignation he didn't know. For a brief second Izuku thought that was it, but then Agni started to glow. Izuku jumped back just in time, as everything was enveloped in flame. From it, a golden figure walked out. Izuku's enemy was now surrounded in beautiful sunset fire, weaving around his limbs and body like a cloak. Agni spit out a tooth before turning back to him. The smirk looking down on him was gone. In its place were calculating, narrowed red eyes as he pushed his arm back into place with a crack. A trail of blood ran down the side of his head. His spear flew back into his outstretched palm, before being covered in fire as runes Izuku couldn't read appeared. The arrogant showman was gone, and in its place was a ruthless warrior. It seems I've underestimated you, Agni noted. Izuku nodded, bracing himself. I won't make that mistake again. The battle finally started. Agni's fire seemed alive, and for all Izuku knew it could be. It formed into whips and swords, creatures and fireballs as Agni attacked. Izuku's reflexes were put in overdrive, staff carving through the flames. The spear blazed through the air, easily slicing through his air shields. He caught it with his staff, and the heat made him wince. He blocked a golden fist with his palm, feeling it burn through his gauntlet with the brief contact. Close range definitely wasn't safe, and the temperature would only increase as more and more flames covered the field. The crowd was excited, and Izuku was surprised to notice that some were shouting for him as well. Izuku began to get more creative. His air chains struck out at critical points, deflecting the spear or grabbing an arm. He shaped his air shields, curving flames back. Platforms of air let him move through the sky as he weaved through dragons of flame and bursts of fire. He could feel the sweat through his shirt, dripping down his chin only to evaporate instantly. He couldn't handle the heat forever. Agni was relentless. Thin but powerful threads of flame tore his chains. Returned flames were deflected with the spear, and Agni propelled himself with his fire to catch up to him. Instead of dodging, Izuku shaped the air into a handheld shield as he turned to meet the fiery god. Izuku absorbed the impact as the spear tore through his shield like butter, giving him time to land a clean hit across his face. Something broke. Stand still, Bash. Izuku dissolved the platform under them, and Agni tumbled to the ground. Izuku swung the staff again, but Agni was already recovering and caught it in his hand, red eyes alight. Before he could move back, Agni stabbed forward with his other hand. The spear sliced his forearm, the long gash instantly cauterizing as his vision briefly went white. Izuku tore his staff out of Agni's grip, a huge fist of air colliding with his enemy's gut in tangible desperation. Agni bent from the impact, but his arm still lashed out at lightning speed, catching Izuku's throat and lifting him up. The gleaming hand burned, the pain making him scream. Izuku couldn't win with just power. He kicked out on reflex, being dropped. Izuku rolled under the next slash, and saw a burning fireball flying his way. Something tickled the back of Izuku's mind, of beaches and rackets. Instead of dodging, Izuku swung the staff and sent the ball of flame blazing back at Agni. It flew back at twice the speed before of course being absorbed into the spear. Agni was immune to fire. Why was he blocking all flames? Agni was sweating too, and hadn't been walking through the burning fires around the field. Flames didn't affect him, but the heat did. Izuku grinned. Stance 1, sweep. His trusty staff struck Agni's knee, knocking him down. Forming a layered gauntlet around his arm, he gripped the blade of the spear and pushed until it was touching Agni's face. They both winced under the heat, but it clearly did more damage to Izuku's opponent. Agni stepped back, readying to counterattack, and stopped as his back pressed up against a wall. Surprised, he finally looked around. Izuku and Agni were surrounded by dense barriers of air, forming a glowing cube of purple. It was faintly see-through, like colored glass. Agni stared around him before letting out a loud laugh. The cloak of flames grew larger, his face now seeming to glow as he gained a cowl. Fire curled around his armor, tensing for an attack. A fatal mistake. You've trapped yourself in with me. Izuku let a smirk play upon his face, resembling Agni's earlier. It was the other way around. Stance 5. Izuku twisted his body as he began to spin at full speed, pushing his body to its limit. His staff extended, the purple trailing it as he reinforced the swirling air into a powerful tornado. Whirlwind. Inside an enclosed space full of heat. The twister knocked Agni upward, along with all the flames and fire as the heated air rose. The beautiful tornado of orange and purple crashed into the top of the cube, and finally it shattered, letting the swirl of color rise high into the sky. Agni dropped to the ground when it faded, broken spear hitting the field next to him. His armor was burned off at places, and he was completely unconscious. The crowd was silent in awe for a few beats, then it roared. Izuku blinked back at the cheering gods, moving his burnt hand in a sheepish wave. This only made them louder. He felt a smile stretch his face at being so accepted, at this many people not only knowing who he was but praising him. Something strange to imagine mere years ago. Izuku wondered if his old self, the one before all this, would have enjoyed it as much as he did. He slung his staff onto his back, turning to leave. He walked down the glowing hallway, leaving the arena. Izuku chose to ignore the catcalls as he realized his t-shirt was burned off, a faint blush on his cheeks. He should have brought more shirts. At least he had an excuse to try on divine clothing now. They gave Izuku a fitting snow-white cloak after he came back from the arena, adorned in runic designs. Aurora said he looked great, So Izuku was keeping it forever. Heaven had been very impressed when Izuku whacked someone with a stick, recognizing him as the future prince. The palace sent a royal escort to take him and Aurora to the teleportation point, keeping the curious crowd away. Izuku wondered if he would ever get used to that many people existing, much less being around him. From what he read, Earth had billions of people before they vanished. He couldn't even begin to imagine that. Izuku heavily thanked the guards before he left. The first thing Izuku did when they got back was take a nap, passing out on his bed in an instant. He woke up to sunlight shining through his window, feeling more well-rested than he had in decades. Aurora was lost in a book when he came downstairs, eyes scanning the pages at a rapid pace. Izuku knew how absorbed she was, knowing not to interrupt her yet. Izuku was surprised to see a stranger opposite her on the couch, but if Aurora trusted him, he must be safe. He had bright red hair and intelligent blue eyes, framed by glasses. He was dressed light, and Izuku could see the hilt of a sword on his side. The man greeted him with a warm smile when he noticed him coming, petting Kuro absent-mindedly as the cat laid next to him. "Hello. You must be Izuku, Aurora's fiancé, eh? You must be Kensei, Sekmet's husband?" Izuku returned. Kensei let out a small chuckle. "I am. She's mentioned me? Sometimes. Doesn't talk about herself much. I've heard a lot about you though. Your fight was brilliant. Almost no one realizes Agni's major weakness, and your magic was fascinating to watch." Izuku felt himself grin under the earnest praise. "Thanks. You know Agni?" "Former student. Very arrogant, but driven." "You're a teacher?" Izuku asked. It wasn't too surprising, considering how friendly the man was. Kensei nodded. "Me and Sekmet sometimes take on students." "I thought Sekmet rarely took apprentices?" "Yeah. I have taught classes, but my wife usually takes on one serious apprentice at a time." Kensei looked down at Kuro, hands still gracefully stroking black fur. "I also must thank for finding Nox." Izuku blinked. "Who?" Kensei's hand stopped moving. "My cat Nox?" Izuku pointed at familiar black fur and yellow eyes. "That's Kuro." "No, that's Nox." "Are you sure?" Kensei raised a red eyebrow. "I'm pretty sure I would know my own cat. I've had him for centuries. I found Kuro on Earth a decade ago when he must have followed Sekmet. Nox loves her, probably more than me actually. Anyway, Earth cats have a lifespan of like 15 years. If this isn't my blessed cat, then why hasn't he aged?" That did make a lot of sense actually. "Wait, you gave a divine blessing to a cat?" Izuku blurted. Kensei winced, looking a little sheepish. "It was kinda spur of the moment. I found out how long Earth cats lived." From what Izuku had heard, divine blessings seemed very precious. Kensei must care a lot about Kuro. "How about a bet over the cat?" Izuku asked. "What's stopping me from just teleporting Nox out of here?" Izuku met his eyes. "Your pride." Kensei stared at him for a moment, then broke into a grin. "What are your terms?" "We stand apart a fair distance and place Kuro down in the center. If Kuro walks towards you, he's Nox. If he comes to us, he's Kuro." Kensei looked intrigued at the wager. He had obviously known Kuro for far longer than Izuku. Kensei snapped his fingers, and everything shifted. Izuku was now facing Kensei, and Kuro appeared in a glint of blue light between them. Izuku called Kuro softly, hands beckoning. Kensei did the same, and soon they were making strange cat noises in their effort to gain the cat's attention. Yellow eyes flicked between them, contemplating, as Kuro assessed them. The black tail whipped back and forth. After a minute of tense consideration, Kuro's tail stopped moving. He turned, padding towards Aurora. The cat reached her couch and leapt up, curling into her lap. Aurora absent-mindedly stroked his fur with her free hand, still reading her book. Kuro let out a purr. Izuku and Kensei stared for a few moments. Kensei sighed, accepting defeat. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" "Yep." Izuku replied, smug. "The cat stays 1 year on Earth, and 1 on Heaven?" Kensei offered. Izuku tilted his head. "Only if you officiate our wedding." "Deal." They shook hands, an oblivious Aurora between them. 2541. The wedding was a small, special thing. Izuku chose Dagoba Beach, and Aurora immediately agreed. The sunlight touched a small venue, a designated red path leading from the teleportation point to a large, decorated arch. Half of it was runic in design, the other half was snow white and emerald green. The single line of chairs bridged through the red path in the sand. He could see Sekmet, stern face softened into something else, as well as a few gods he assumed to be Aurora's friends. Izuku stood next to Kensei under the arch in his black tuxedo, waiting. The fabric was soft, comforting with a green tie. He returned Sekmet's wave, smiling at the wind gently rippling through his hair and the sand beneath his red shoes. Aurora and Amaterasu appeared in a brilliant flash of light, violet and royal purple swirling together. Particles drifted through the air, meeting the sand. It was the most dramatic warp Izuku had ever seen. The light faded, revealing the daughter and mother linked arm in arm. The audience swiveled in their chairs to see. He saw Kensei smile out of the corner of Izuku's eye, and Izuku stared. Aurora was in a bright white gown, the sunlight reflecting off the dress and making her purple hair shimmer in a way that felt absolutely magical as it rested past her exposed shoulders. The train of the dress smoothly floated just above the sand as her mother led her down the makeshift aisle. Aurora saw him then, her eyes sparkling in excitement. "Holy shit!" Izuku breathed. Kensei coughed next to him, bringing him out of his trance. Izuku blinked, realizing that Aurora had already walked up to him. Her eyes were fond, lifting up to his. "Hi." Her cheeks were tinted red, showing she hadn't missed his reaction. "Hi," Izuku said back. Kensei's speech washed over Izuku as he focused on the goddess in front of him. His green eyes were deep into her purple. The practiced vow flowed smoothly off his suddenly dry lips. Aurora said hers back, naturally poetic, and Izuku was moving. His hand gently cupped the back of her neck, pulling her towards him as he pressed his lips against hers. His hand slid to her back. Izuku's other arm curled around the dress as he dipped her down. Izuku felt Aurora smile against his mouth as she kissed him back hard. She tasted like sunlight, warm and soft and sweet. The audience cheered and shouted somewhere behind him, but Izuku barely heard it, like he was deep underwater. He finally came up for air after a few moments, their grins matching. On impulse, his hand went under her legs and he lifted the princess off her feet into a princess carry. Izuku cut off Aurora's surprised shout with another blissful kiss. Izuku spun her in his arms with a wide grin, wind rushing through his hair and purple eyes still locked on green. 2548. Their honeymoon was an extended trip through the wonderland that was heaven. The divinity now in his veins let him teleport to designated points himself, as he had seen Aurora and Sekmet do countless times. The ability was required to travel the vast realm. Warping, as Izuku called it, would always be unique. Everything he was broke into purple particles, his body dissolving into light like he was becoming mana itself. Yet the whole thing didn't hurt at all. Instead, Izuku felt free, almost pure before he reformed on the other side within seconds. Heaven was so large that there were still vast stretches of nature untouched by civilization, despite the population. One of Izuku's favorite examples was the tundra Aurora showed him last year, a spot they used for training. Miles and miles of winter were laid out around him, in entrancing hills of snow. Izuku's white cloak staved off the cold as he watched Aurora practice her magic, the light making the carpet of white glow violet. Izuku hadn't let go of the idea of Aurora flying. It was such an amazing thing for him to imagine, cruising through the sky under your own power. Aurora's magic really was wonderful, the applications limitless. She hasn't found one yet, but there had to be a way. The first thing she tried was propulsion. Beams of light from her hands and feet could launch her in any direction easily. But there wasn't much control, especially the higher she flew. Aurora stood on a platform of light for the next attempt, levitating the construction higher and higher until Izuku had to shield his eyes against the sunlight. It seemed to be working, but once it started moving faster, Aurora was thrown off and Izuku kicked off the snow, catching her in his arms as she fell. His scarf blowed past him in the frosty wind. They went through a few more ideas before she tried something different. Aurora concentrated, gradually forming a large eagle out of her mana. Sharp eyes gazed down at her, the majestic bird almost twice her height. It bent down, letting her gracefully leap onto its back, then shot off the ground with a powerful flap of its wings. She circled Izuku from above, arms lifting towards the sky. Aurora grinned. After a few minutes, though, it was clear a large living creature took too much mana to sustain. Aurora landed back next to him, out of breath, the violet eagle slowly dissolving. Izuku insisted on a short break after that attempt, grabbing water from his bag and holding it towards her until she took it. Aurora rolled her eyes at his nursing, but couldn't hide a small smile. "Goodbye, Sam," Aurora said sadly, as the last of the violet eagle vanished. "You named it Sam?" Izuku asked, amused. "Him," Aurora corrected. "You named him Sam?" "He looked like a Samda, I guess. I thought you would name him something cool, like Windwalker or something." "That sounds lame. Your names aren't exactly the best, you know," Aurora teased. Izuku held a hand on his heart, mock offended. "Slander. From my own beautiful wife. You named our black cats Blacks. Are you ever going to get over that?" Kensei named him the same thing. Aurora laughed, a bright sound that made the icy hills feel several degrees warmer. "Nope. I'll hold it over you forever. When we have a child, you don't get to name it. You would probably name them a old human reference or something, and then our child would hate us forever." "Izuku?" Izuku just stared at her, frozen like the landscape around him. Aurora stopped her ramble, going completely red. She covered her face with her hands. There was a pause. "Did you mean it?" Izuku asked quietly, emotion leaking into his voice. "The naming thing? I mean, if you really want to dash." "Aurora." Izuku cut her off, slowly pulling her hands away so he could see her eyes. Purple eyes met his. "I want kids. I mean, they're so adorable and everything, but I know we only got married a few years ago," and Aurora trailed off, carefully watching his reaction. She hadn't been this nervous in centuries. This must be incredibly important to her. He already knew his answer. "Sure," Izuku said simply. Why wouldn't I want our family to be bigger? Because that's what she was offering him. Not just Sekmet and Amaterasu, who were technically related to him now, but their own actual family. Aurora gave him a searing kiss in response, tackling him in a hug. Izuku laughed at her excitement as she knocked him down on the frosty ground. They went back to training after calming down, his green scarf now checkered with snow. She tried something similar to the platform, forming small circles under her feet and mana surrounding her to stabilize. It was clumsy and unrefined, but it seemed to be progress. "Aurora?" Izuku called after watching her glide around a while. She floated down, surprisingly seeming relieved at doing so. "Yes? Why don't you cover yourself in your mana completely? Wouldn't that be better?" Aurora tilted her head. "I would have, but I can't layer it over myself accurately. Unless you have a mirror, the closest I would get would be like armor, and it wouldn't fly well." She shrugged. Izuku placed a hand under his chin in thought. "I'll do it." Divine marriage was special compared to humans. The process also connected mana, letting each god use the other's mana in close proximity. This was part of what made it the ultimate source of trust. A god's mana was part of them, just like a limb. Aurora's eyes widened at his words, and she searched his face. Izuku held firm, and she eventually nodded her assent. She trusted him. Izuku gently held both of her hands in his, closing his eyes. He immediately saw his own mana, always stretching out to interact with other beings and objects, and pushed past it. Izuku focused on the second source of mana, bright and warm and safe, almost as familiar as his own. It washed over him for a moment, like a river of energy. Izuku imagined the complex light construct he needed, shaping it around his wife. When he opened his eyes, Aurora wore a new purple cloak made entirely of mana. It slid over her body and her jacket like a second skin, covering her up to the neck. Aurora twirled smoothly, looking down at it amazed, then took a step back to test it. The mana cloak glowed, and suddenly Aurora shot up into the air. It was perfect, giving her complete omnidirectional movement. The cloak was durable and flexible, so she could fight in it too. Aurora let out an excited shout as she flew loops in the air, leaving trails of purple light in her wake. Izuku grinned up at his wife as he sat back on the snow. He could watch her be purely happy for hours. 2729. Kensei occasionally sparred against Izuku. Practice against someone else with a weapon was useful, and his magic was a definite challenge to fight as well. Unlike Sekmet though, in a fight Kensei talked a lot. Maybe it was payback for the cat thing? Izuku tried to tune him out, but it was largely unsuccessful. Are you even trying? I can't believe you're attacking me with a stick. You missed. Are you okay? Took a hard hit there. You missed again. Is your hair getting in your eyes? Maybe get a haircut, man. Yes, I'm teleporting. But that's no excuse. Izuku suddenly broke off his swing, pivoting on his foot as he aimed right where Kensei was about to reappear, finally punching Kensei's annoying mouth and pushing him back across the sand. Kensei paused for a moment of blissful silence, raising a hand to his annoying, uninjured face, before grinning in warm pride. That was great. I wasn't expecting that feint, very clever of you. Now Izuku couldn't even be mad at him. The nerve. He knew now why Agni had seemed so angry. Contrary to his personality, Kensei was ridiculously powerful. He didn't use the sword at his waist. The sheer power Izuku could feel from it was terrifying, even sheathed. Instead, Kensei pulled out a wooden bakken out of a thin blue rift in the air. Despite seeming to be ordinary wood, it met Izuku's reinforced staff with ease, not showing a single hint of damage by the time they stopped to rest. Izuku glared at the weapon like it was responsible for all his problems. Kensei's earlier taunts finally began to register in his post-combat mind. Wait, you're using a stick too? Izuku blurted, indignant. Kensei blinked slowly, then laughed. Yeah, but I'm winning. Izuku couldn't really say anything to that. 2893. Two gods sparred on the beach, sunlight shining through clear skies. It just doesn't make any sense. Izuku muttered, watching the fight in front of him. Kensei twirled the bakken in his hand, deflecting all the approaching balls of light. He cut one in half, and just before he got hit by a violet bolt of energy, he suddenly shifted 10 meters to the right. Is this about the stick again? Sekmet asked, sitting next to him on the sand. She didn't even look up, playing Tetris on her phone. Yes, it's about the stick. Look at that thing, it's not even scratched. Izuku exclaimed. Aurora slashed down with a giant axe of hardened light, and it was effortlessly blocked by wood before Kensei went to counter at blinding speed. Aurora's purple cloak appeared, flying her out of sword range. Sekmet rolled her eyes. Why don't you just ask him? You've been on this for over a century. But that would ruin the whole point. Plus, he would probably be like, what? It's just a wooden bakken. What if it is just a wooden bakken? Then how is it so durable? Sekmet shrugged. Maybe you're just weak. Why don't you break it then? Too much effort. Izuku opened his mouth, then closed it. An array of violet spears and swords blazed towards the swordsman, Aurora's frustration visible. Kensei parried a few, then slashed the air in front of him with a powerful swing. Light blue outlined the cut, carving a small gap in the fabric of space that the remaining projectiles flew into. He closed the gap with a smirk. They watched Aurora and Kensei spar for a few minutes. What do divine blessings cost, anyway? Izuku asked suddenly. Sekmet's finger paused for half a second before clearing another line. What? Amaterasu and Aurora treat it as something precious, yet Kensei hands one out to a cat he just met. The gods in heaven don't seem to know much. Izuku turned to Sekmet, and she finally looked up. And you don't mention divine blessings at all. The goddess put her phone into her jeans with a sigh. I forget how curious you are sometimes. Like in a good way? Sekmet ignored him. Divine blessings are pretty rare. It takes a lot of mana to even be able to do so, and the blesser loses some mana permanently. That's part of the reason why it's seen as a sign of trust, since you can't take something like that back. Red eyes flicked back to the fight in front of them. As for Nox, Kensei is very impulsive. Izuku laughed, and the corner of Sekmet's mouth lifted. Have you ever given a divine blessing before? Sekmet didn't say anything for a moment, sharp features growing a tiny bit more rigid. once, she said quietly. If I tell you, will you stop annoying me for now? Izuku nodded, abashed. Sekmet leaned back into the sand. It happened centuries ago. Maybe 800-ish years by now? Humanity was starting to manifest abilities, or quirks as they called them. Emitter quirks are similar to magic really, but transformative and mutant quirks are unique. Sekmet glanced at Izuku, who was listening with rapt attention, before continuing. People without these abilities, the quirkless majority, began to fear the quirked. They were more powerful, different. It's in this time that two brothers were born. They had white hair, like you do. Izuku's hand went to his head, surprised. That was one of the only things the two brothers had in common though. The younger brother was kind and meek, yet had sparks of bravery. The older brother is more cunning, ambitious. The younger had seemingly no power at all, while his brother's ability let him have all the power he ever could want. The older brother was nice at first, collecting abilities from those too scared to hold them and giving them to those who craved uniqueness of their own. But then, he wanted more. Izuku finished. Sekmet nodded. The older brother slowly conquered with overwhelming power paired with smarts. The younger tried to stop him, their relationship eventually crumbling, but was too weak, powerless. But he kept trying. I wasn't sure why this stood out to me so much, maybe I saw myself in him. So I helped as much as I was allowed. Izuku's eyes widened. I gave the younger brother a tiny bit of my enhancement magic. But to my surprise, it molded with the quirk he never knew he had into something completely new, a mix of quirk and magic. He could transfer all of the compound to someone new, keeping the remains of energy within himself. So that's what he did before the older brother killed him. And then they passed it off to someone before going off to die, and this cycle kept repeating. Sekmet sighed. I don't know why this bothers me after so long. The users would be dead in like a century anyway if the compound was never made, and I've killed far more gods. But it does. So I don't know if I could ever bless someone again. This was probably the most he had ever heard her speak at one time. It's not your fault, you know. The younger brother would have fought and died without your blessing, and the other users wouldn't just ignore the threat. Izuku said softly. If anything, you helped the younger brother by giving him the ability to do something. Sekmet didn't say anything for a moment, closing her eyes. Sunlight poked through her blonde hair. Thanks, Izuku. Izuku turned his attention back to the fight in time to see it end, Aurora yielding to the bakken resting on her neck. She seemed happy despite her loss, talking to Kensei before he went to leave, walking to the teleportation point. Hey Kensei. Wait. Izuku shouted. Yeah. Kensei stopped looking at him. Is your wooden bakken magical? Or is the wood on heaven like, special or something? How did you make it so durable? Kensei stared at him in confusion. What? It's just a wooden bakken. 2960. Akari was born. She had green eyes and familiar purple hair, and was so small. Izuku was terrified. They displayed enough power to level an Earth city on a daily basis, and here was this tiny adorable creature. He had absolute control of his strength, but now he was extra careful whenever he was near his daughter. His daughter? Despite this, Izuku loved holding her. The tiny bundle of green in his arms was so light that he barely felt her, yet at the same time every shift made him so happy. Akari seemed to like being held by Aurora a bit more, but Izuku didn't hold that against her. Aurora was amazing after all. The kind people at the palace were extremely helpful in what they needed to raise a baby. They even had guidebooks. Izuku missed being able to sleep in though. Besides them, there was no one else on Earth making any noise. But now, midnight wails were a constant. Akari was so loud. How did her small lungs even do that? 3010. Akari was unfortunately old enough to attend school. Gods didn't put their children into any kind of preschool like humans, raising them at home for the early stage of their life. After age 50, the school system progressed in a rank system. The ranks didn't have a set time that each student had to take them for. Instead, students progressed at their own rate and tested out whenever they were ready. It was a flexible system. The 10th rank was specialized and usually the longest, depending on whatever career the student wanted to go into. Neither of them had known how she would age, being half human and half goddess. But according to Aurora, she seemed to age just as much as a normal baby god. Currently at 50, Akari resembled a human toddler. Divine life was quite long compared to humans. Izuku had thought about this before, yet so much time had passed he was now on the other side of the equation. Records he had read showed the human lifespan was constantly increasing, currently at an average of maybe 100, ignoring healing/age-related quirks. An entire human's life could go by in the time it took Izuku's daughter to become a teenager. If humanity came back, it would probably be depressing watching them die so fast. Izuku winced, shoving the thought deep under. He couldn't remember the old Izuku, as it makes more sense to call him the young Izuku. To him, the 18 years he had spent alive must have felt like an eon. The difference between him and his past self was strange to think about. Young Izuku had green hair. Izuku supposed it matched his eyes, but anything other than snow white was almost impossible to imagine now. A small head slumped onto his shoulder, bringing him out of his thoughts. Izuku glanced at the now unconscious girl next to him, passed out on the couch. Foundations of Mana and its usage rested on her lap, the book still lying open. Thinking was a big part of him, and if he wasn't stopped, Izuku might keep thinking and thinking until the paths diverged and curved into each other. There were more important things to him now than the past, though. Izuku placed her book on the table in front of him, sliding a glowing bookmark into it. Gently he picked up his daughter, walking up the stairs. "Dad?" Izuku looked down, seeing her start to stir. "Yeah? We're going up to your room." "I'm not tea-tired," Akari slurred drowsily in protest, eyes half open. Of course not." Izuku tucked Akari in with her green covers, watching his daughter fight back a yawn. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Izuku asked. Akari nodded, purple hair trailing the motion. What if the other gods don't like me because I'm a demigod? Or I'm not smart enough? The other gods are going to already have magic and everything." Izuku smiled softly. She rambled when she was nervous, just like Aurora. He carefully reached out, brushing back the hair that had fallen over her eyes. "Akari, classes haven't even started and you're already reading about mana. You're going to do amazing, you're a genius," Izuku said, putting every ounce of his sincerity behind the words. And she would. Akari had that same drive he did to discover things, to learn about them. Akari loved reading even more than Izuku, something that made him ridiculously happy. "And being a demigod just makes you special, right?" Akari beamed at him. "Yeah." Izuku smiled back, soft. "You should rest now, you'll have to get up early." Izuku kissed her on the forehead, giving Akari a final glance before closing the door lightly behind him. Aurora got home 2 hours later, exhausted. There was a teleportation point directly in their living room, so they didn't have to go to the beach and back every time they visited heaven. Aurora's required duties as the princess weren't too bad, but she did have to attend meetings. Meetings which dragged on with debates. Izuku let her vent as he half-hugged her on the couch. "How's she?" "Big day tomorrow?" Aurora asked, leaning into him. "I think she's okay now. I talked to her, she was pretty worried." Izuku rubbed small circles on her back, and she murmured appreciatively. "Ah yes, worry. Akari gets that from you." Aurora nodded sagely. "And was rambling just like you do." Izuku finished. "What? I don't ramble." "No clue what you mean." Izuku stared at her blankly. "Okay, maybe I've rambled before," Aurora admitted. "What did you tell Akari?" "That she was amazing and is going to do great." Aurora smiled. "Yeah. She will. Akari's going to outpace all of them, watch." "Izuku, it's not a competition. The other kids won't stand a chance." 3072. Akari's magic came in. Izuku had met Aurora when her magic was fully developed, and lacked the skill to truly understand when he received his own. Seeing Akari's mana slowly grow over years was beautiful, like a blooming flower. Her mana was a pure white, and she almost seemed born for light magic. Aurora showed her how to make a simple ball of light, patiently guiding her through the process of using mana. Akari's grin didn't fade for weeks. She was already at the 4th rank in her education, ahead of most students her age. Despite how proud he was, Izuku was careful not to pressure her into advancing, letting Akari set her own pace. Divine Education covered many subjects, with more course options the higher rank you were. Mandatory classes included academics along with hand-to-hand combat and mana foundations. After getting their mana after about a century, gods could take mana application to actually learn to use magic. Despite her Ainital worries, Akari absolutely loved school. The only class she didn't like was history, and honestly Izuku didn't blame her. Gods had far more history than humans did. Izuku lifted himself up, pausing in his one-armed handstand to check on Akari. She was drawing something intricate across the room, eyes narrowed in concentration. Her pen tapped against her chin, debating something as she hunched over her desk. "Homework?" Izuku asked. Akari sighed. "Yeah, runes." Izuku tilted his head, long used to the feeling of all the blood rushing to it. "I thought you loved runes?" "I do, but right now this just..." Akari glared down at the paper in front of her. "Isn't working. Maybe you need a break?" Izuku suggested. Akari placed the pen flat on her desk, watching him move up and down curiously. She wandered over, plopping down in front of him on the soft carpet. Akari struggled to lift herself up into a handstand, her eyes twinkling at him when she managed to stay upright. "You know, this isn't really what I meant by taking a break." Akari's arms bent, straining as her head approached the ground then lifted up again. "It's a change of pace. Whatever works for you, I guess." Izuku gave the upside-down equivalent of a shrug. They trained for a while, as Izuku worked through the end of his routine. Akari kept pace as well as she could. "Your stamina is pretty good." Akari rolled her eyes. "You're not even sweating, and you've been doing this for hours on one arm." "Akari, I've been doing push-ups for like 800 years. You're fine." The demigod scrunched her nose. "How old?" "I'm not old." Izuku protested. "That sounds like something an old person would say." Izuku sighed dramatically. "Children, they grow up to be so cruel." "I'm not a child." Akari insisted. "You're not." "I'm 112 years old." "The baby really..." Akari pouted, making her look adorable. Her arms were starting to shake from effort of holding herself up. "See, can I join you on your sacred routines?" Akari asked. Izuku glanced at her. "Sacred? I've watched you do it my entire life." Akari panted. "I can't even remember you missing a day either. By now I have the workout memorized." "I asked a long time ago, but you said I couldn't." Akari's arms gave out, and she tumbled onto her back. Izuku pushed off his hand, sitting down next to her as she tried to catch her breath. "Of course you can," Izuku answered. Akari blinked. "Really? I didn't want you to do it before because you were young and could have hurt yourself." Izuku shrugged. "My daily routine is something special to me, but of course I would love to share it with you." "We'd work up slowly, adding to it like I did." Her eyes were wide. "You're going to train me?" "Well, yeah, why wouldn't Dash?" Izuku was cut off by a hug that hit him like a tidal wave. 3090. Akari turned out to have an innate ability for reinforcement magic as well. Izuku enjoyed passing on his skills, and his daughter was an incredibly fast learner. Part of it was that she had someone to properly teach her unlike him, but beyond that she just adapted to new information quickly. Light and reinforcement magic paired well together. Akari could enhance anything she made, since it was easier to flow mana into mana constructions over actual objects. Izuku preferred to hold their sessions on Earth, with almost pure silence. A forest was the perfect place to practice magic. Mana was everywhere around them, in the trees, plants, and soil beneath them. Akari's eyes squinted shut in concentration as her palm rested on a fallen tree. Her snow-white mana flowed into the wood, gathering around her hand before spreading up through the branches. Izuku lightly poked the dead tree, seeing her enhancement hold firm. "You're getting good at this," Izuku commented. Akari smiled under the praise. "It's kinda hard, sustaining mana over something this big." "Who taught you all of this stuff, anyway?" Izuku shrugged. "Aurora showed me the basics, but most of it is just trial and error." Izuku lifted his hand, twisting purple strands of air into a swirling ball. The wind sphere floated above his palm. "Took me a while to do anything weird like this. I pushed the idea of enhancement so far, It turned into manipulation. Izuku let the wind dissipate. Really, I think your time would be a lot better spent on other magic. Fascinating. Izuku startled at the sudden voice behind him, his staff in his hands instantly as he spun. He had grown quite comfortable in his ability to sense mana. Not only was it excellent in combat, but to someone barely used to people, knowing who was around him was essential. Yet this woman didn't seem to give off any mana at all. If I didn't know any better, I would think that was wind magic, yet instead the air itself is becoming more durable as you reinforce it into shape. There isn't any visible effort on your part either. How remarkable! Green eyes glanced around him rapidly as the blonde's words turned into incomprehensible muttering. Izuku blinked. Thanks. Sensei? What are you doing here? Akari asked from behind him. Izuku relaxed seeing that she knew the strange character, slinging his staff over his back. The goddess pushed up her glasses, snapping out of her thoughts. Sorry, I get lost thinking about magic sometimes. I'm Loki, and I teach every magic class at Arcadia. I've been wanting to meet you. Izuku shook the offered hand, a little concerned. I'm Izuku. You said you teach every magic class? Arcadia was a massive school, and Izuku distinctly remembered the crowd of students whenever he dropped Akari off. In response, 2 more Lokis materialized next to the original, seemingly perfect replicas. Her mana suddenly emerged from however it had been hidden with a green glow, surrounding all 3 Lokis. The clones happily waved at him and Akari before vanishing. Amazing! I can teach multiple classes like this. It's incredibly useful. That's part of why I'm here, actually. Loki said cheerfully. She roamed into her bag for a few moments before pulling out a bright pink envelope. Izuku carefully opened it, curious. Green eyes scanned the paper, growing more and more incredulous. Dad, what is it? Akari asked, trying to read over his shoulder. You're offering me a job? Izuku stared at her in disbelief. Yep. As a magic instructor at Arcadia. As the only other magic teacher, help would be great. Is this a joke? Nope. I'm a human though, right? Loki shrugged. You're considered an adult by godly standards, and have a ridiculously good grasp on magic theory. Plus, you're literally the prince. I can only use reinforcement magic though. Izuku pointed out. I've heard from the Royal Library you've researched a number of the other types anyway. And reinforcement magic is part of the curriculum. I came here to see what kind of person you were before making this offer, but from what I saw it's clear that you love teaching. Loki finished brightly. He didn't exactly need a job, being a prince. There were also no bills to pay on an abandoned Earth. But teaching would definitely be a new experience, an interesting one. And Izuku wouldn't have to worry about Akari, since she would be in school at the same time he was. Sure. Izuku answered finally. But only if you teach me how you hid your mana earlier. Loki grinned. That's how Izuku found himself walking into a classroom full of children a month later. 30 pairs of eyes snapped to him instantly. Izuku took in the large space, staring back at rows of confused yet curious faces. Why had he thought this was a good idea? Hello everyone. I'll be teaching courses on magic from now on. My name is Izuku, so just call me that or sensei I guess. Izuku spelled his name in the air. The words traced under his finger, lighting up with purple mana. Izuku opened his mouth to continue, but then a hand shot up from near the front in a burst of motion. Izuku blinked at the girl, confused. Did she have a question? He hadn't even started teaching yet. Yes? Izuku asked. The redhead seemed to be about Akari's age. What did you just do? Also you're the prince, right? I've seen you on the holoscreen. Are you going to teach this course? That would be so cool. Or are you subbing for Loki-sensei? I hope she's okay. The girl suddenly stopped in her verbal barrage, cheeks flushing. What's your name? Velicitious, she murmured, embarrassed. Sorry, Izuku-sama, I'm just really curious. Izuku smiled at her. Curiosity will take you far. What I just did was reinforcement magic. I am the prince, yes, I've married. Into the royal family. I'm not sure when you would have seen me, though I do go out in public from time to time. I'm not subbing in for Loki, I'm a new magic instructor that will be taking over some of her classes. He glanced around the room, seeing most of them listening intently. You guys can ask me questions at any time, just wait till I call on you and tell me your name first. A hand raised near the back. I'm Perseus. Reinforcement magic enhances tools and weapons, right? So how did you manifest words out of nothing, Izuku-sama? The boy asked. Izuku winced at the honorific. Please, call me sensei. Samit feels quite odd. Sorry, Izuku-sensei. Reinforcement magic does enhance solid objects, correct. But applying this to liquids and gases will let you harden and manipulate them. As Izuku spoke, the air around the room slowly shifted. His reinforcement took hold, and the students gazed around them in wonder as purple threads levitated their pens, flew past them, and formed into shapes. The room was filled with light dancing above their heads. He ended his little show with the strands floating up, disappearing as his mana left the air. Like so. The way they stared at him in pure awe made him grin. Impressing adults was one thing, but nothing compared to the feeling of broadening the world of a child. How come we've never heard of anyone doing this with reinforcement magic before? Perseus asked, eyes wide. Because no one put this much time into developing it before me? Izuku replied simply. And that's what I'm here to teach you. How to learn to push your magic into something new, something wonderful. The lesson went far better than Izuku had ever expected, his new students absorbing information like sponges. He felt himself relax, growing used to the attention and enjoying how natural it all felt. The bell seemed to ring far too early. 3092. With a mischievous smile, Loki raised her hands once again. In an instant, the feeling of her mana was gone. It was like there was a void of space. Izuku could see her, and knew the goddess was in front of him. But at the same time, his honed mana sense told him he was alone, that there was nothing there. Even knowing about it, the ability was terrifying. I'll take that as a compliment, Loki said dryly, mana popping back into existence. Even after centuries, Izuku couldn't stop muttering. Why did you make some of these techniques, by the way? None of it is offensive, but it's really clever. Loki paused, smile fading, and Izuku quickly reassured. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. Loki's voice held firm. It's fine, Izuku. There was a war a long time ago. How well versed are you on our history? I've been going through some of it, but the amount of events in divine history is incredible. Did you fight in it? Izuku asked carefully. Something like that? Loki glanced down at her hands. I'm not much of a fighter. But I wanted to help, so dash. Were you a spy? Yep. Got secrets, plans. General chaos. They gave me a title actually, the trickster. Being able to change my form was invaluable. However, it's useless unless my mana is hidden as well. So this was my solution, void. You know, you're a lot better at naming things than I am. Izuku commented. It earned him a small smile. I've heard. Akari says all your technique names are ridiculous. Wow. That traitor. Loki laughed, and a bit of the darkness in her eyes faded. He was glad for it. Ready to try void again? She asked. Izuku nodded, focusing on the feeling of mana inside of him. The familiar energy rose to meet him, but that wasn't what he wanted for once. He tried to suppress his mana, pushing it further down inside of him. Anything? He asked. Nope. Izuku frowned. What was he doing wrong here? He had been at this for months. Probably noticing his disappointment, Loki started to reassure him. It's fine, don't worry if you don't get it right away. Using magic was about embracing your mana, letting it grow and guiding it. What he was attempting to do was the opposite, so he expected it to be hard. Yet there hadn't been any progress at all. According to Loki, his presence hadn't twitched. Not even sure how I do it, and my magic is perfect for this stuff. So then he was going about this the wrong way. Suppressing his mana meant hiding it deeper in himself. It would still be there though, and manipulating his mana like that would only make his presence more obvious. So it might take you a while. You never told me why you wanted me to teach you this anyway. Hey wait, are you even listening? Loki invented this technique, but the amount of instinct and personal mana use meant that explaining how it worked was hard. But when she used it, her mana seemed to be completely gone, not diminished. It was so simple, Izuku wondered how he hadn't thought of it before. Got it? Loki blinked. What dash? Izuku let his purple mana pass through his circuits, pushing it out through his body. But instead of flowing it into the air, he let it run through existence itself, filling into the space around him. Kensei came to mind, his blade carving into reality like butter. That strange emptiness the slashes opened was what Izuku aimed for. And Izuku could feel his own presence vanish, suddenly unable to sense himself for the first time. He glanced down at his palms with a smile, the feeling strange yet fun. In contrast, everything around him seemed to burst into his awareness. Izuku couldn't do any magic with his mana woven into reality, but with his mana touching his surroundings, his mana sensing had improved by leaps and bounds. He could feel every tree around him and their shapes, every fallen stick and hidden rock. Izuku had never known the ground beneath his feet, earth, this clearly before. Loki's jaw dropped. Izuku noticed that she stood out, a beacon of green mana the shade of her eyes. If he looked at Amaterasu like this, he would probably go blind instantly. Loki closed her mouth with an amused sigh. You really are a genius? Izuku grinned at her. Why didn't you tell me about the sensing? This is amazing. The sensing? My sensing abilities don't change when I erase my mana. How exactly did you do it? Izuku told her, watching her eyes get wider the more he explained. I just suppress my mana. My magic is extraordinary at trickery and stealth. But you found a way to sense things as well. The things we could do with this? Loki said, excited. Izuku matched her smile, pulling out a new notebook. Let's push this further. They lost track of time as they worked, twin mutters blending together in a stream of ideas and research. Aurora found them hours later, shaking her head with a smile at the pile notebooks laid around the forest floor. In a well-practiced motion, she poked Izuku on the forearm. He glanced up from his writing, surprised. The sun was starting to set. How long dash? You two have been here all day. Aurora glanced down. Research, probably. If it was anyone else, I would have been worried. Have either of you even eaten? Guilty silence. Aurora let out a sigh. Children, really. I ordered food anyway, come on. You're my favorite. Izuku stated. I know. Thanks, princess. Loki said brightly. Just call me Aurora. Gladly, Aurora. Aurora squinted at her in consideration. If I ask, would you drop the sama? Nope. 3121. Izuku's classroom was huge for a reason. No one was more excited than in personal practice, when Izuku let them work on whatever magic they wanted. Fireballs flew around the room, lightning crashed into the desks and walls. If the room wasn't so durable, it would collapse every week. Izuku zipped around the room, keeping everyone safe at supersonic speeds. They were having fun, but the control of the godly equivalent of teenagers was terrible. Izuku-sensei? He barely heard him over the chaos. Yeah? Izuku asked, reaching his desk. Leo was one of his quieter students, which wasn't great when half the class was talking to each other. I'm trying to do something, but it isn't really working. Izuku hummed. What exactly are you doing? A bit of excitement was visible in the boy's eyes, and it made Izuku smile. I love my fire and everything, but dash. The classroom around them slowed as Izuku accelerated, cutting the boy off mid-sentence as his mouth stopped. The world came to a halt as he reached max speed, mana and energy stuck in the air. Everybody froze, like a chaotic group picture. Izuku started walking. He moved carefully, weaving through the bodies and misguided attacks. He saw some sort of impressive mini-tornado in the middle of unfurling and gently pulled a girl's head from where she stared down at it. He pushed a boy talking to her just out of its range, and as an afterthought reduced the spin on the twister a small amount. A guy had actually tripped, and with no one to hear him, Izuku freely chuckled at the wide-eyed shock before placing him firmly on the floor. Izuku sighed when he finally reached the corner, 3 boys pooling their fire magic together in some sort of ball. Somehow, he had missed them pulling off this stunt before it was almost too late. Their faces were captured in grins, and Izuku could definitely admire the effort. But that thing was clearly about to explode. His body was starting to feel the strain of moving at this speed, a familiar burn. Izuku grabbed the fiery ball out of the air and crushed it in his palm, dispelling the mana instantly. Izuku glanced around for any other reckless children before stepping back to Leo and letting the world continue its flow around him. The sound came back in a rush, and Izuku swatched Leo's mouth slowly start to move once more. But it's almost purely offensive. Fire is super cool in fights and everything. Leo made a little spark with his hands. But I want to show how beautiful it is too. Is that dumb? Izuku shook his head. Of course not, that's amazing. He pointed at the other side of the room, the boy following his gaze. Those three lost control of a triple fireball and almost killed us all a second ago. I'm definitely on board for less destructive fire spells. Leo looked incredibly alarmed, and Izuku laughed. What's your idea? What if fire didn't burn anyone? Izuku tilted his head. Like in an intimidation tactic? Or the enemy's fire? No, I mean what if I only burned mana? I could protect everyone, and neutralize attacks at the same time. Izuku's eyes widened. By literally burning them out, yet without any danger. The perfect peacekeeping technique. That's genius, kid. Leo's cheeks blushed. Thanks, Izuku-sama. Come on, you just called me sensei. Izuku protested. Leo's reply was drowned out by the bell, and Izuku glanced up at the clock. All right everyone, that's it. Keep practicing, just please have supervision or something. Especially if you're going to make giant tornadoes or fire bombs. The mentioned kids looked down, sheepish. Izuku shook his head with a smile. Dismissed. Akari met him outside the school. Izuku met her eyes curiously. You got out early? Izuku asked. Akari nodded. I think we broke the substitute. Was kind of sad, really. Izuku winced in sympathy. Children could be merciless. He followed her to a grass field near the edge of the grounds, watching his daughter stretch, and copied her. Guess you want to spar. Right after classes too. Akari grinned. Yep. Today's the day I beat you. Isn't that what you said last time? Izuku teased. I mean, you haven't beaten your teacher either. Akari retorted. Izuku paused, looking through years of fights. She was right, he had never actually beaten Sekmet before. And starting right after I've taught my classes when I'm usually tired isn't a coincidence either, right? Izuku asked. No idea what you're talking about. Akari lifted her hand, a perfect sphere of white light resting on her palm. Izuku watched, surprised, as the white split into 6 smaller balls of light. Together they made up the rainbow, a spectrum of color. That's new. Izuku commented. I call it prism. Each orb floated up, taking up positions around her in a circle. Then they struck. Each ball flew separately, controlled with extreme precision as they attacked together. Red and orange rushed towards his head first, forcing him to duck. Yellow streaked at his exposed neck, and a barrier of air deflected it towards green. When'd you think of this? Izuku asked, impressed. His staff blocked red and yellow as they bounced back. Purple and blue struck at his blind spots, keeping constant pressure. A decade ago. Cool, right? Out of the corner of his eyes, Izuku noticed her eyebrows were tightly knit in concentration. Then, each color started transforming. Izuku sped up as each light suddenly became a sword, twisting through the storm in a blur of motion. He wrapped the blades in chains of air as he countered, staff beating them back. The chains limited their motion, giving him less to keep track of. Izuku was proud of her, manipulating that many projectiles wasn't easy. But something like this had its weaknesses. His chains suddenly multiplied, catching every sword at once as they reoriented for another assault. Akari turned them into circular saws, cutting through their bindings, but the effort to do so left her completely open. Akari barely dodged his fist, and it breezed past her hair. In the same breath, Izuku's leg swung low and knocked her off her feet and onto the grass. He went to follow up, but then that same white light glowed from her hand. Everything went completely white. Izuku blinked in surprise, but nothing changed. He was completely blind. On instinct, he activated Void, his mana sense growing exponentially. His vision covered, Izuku instead felt the lights return. Saws of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple flew at him from all angles. The staff went back into its sheath. He had no need for it. He closed his eyes, filtering out his eyesight completely to focus on his mana sense. Akari's patterns were getting more creative, he noticed. Green swung for his legs, almost blending in with what his senses told him was grass. Izuku sidestepped a red dagger, watching purple cut through the space in front of him. He flipped over blue, the huge spear making his hair rustle. He stepped back as orange and yellow tried to wrap him with rope, and red cut through it. But despite all this movement, the white mass was still at the exact same spot. Izuku rushed towards it. The white form shifted, a limb extended towards him. He twisted, blocking the blow and launching his own. The blazing punch stopped just in front of her face. The effects followed a second later. The burst of wind was massive, and in his night vision her hair blew past. The air shook from the punch, the shockwave swept through the grass, and the trees in the distance shifted with the force. Izuku opened his eyes. Akari was staring at him in pure awe. The grass behind her was completely flattened for miles. "Dad, you're fucking overpowered." "Akari." Izuku smirked. He dropped his fist, watching her lights return back to her palm and vanish. She dropped onto the grass, catching her breath. "That ability has a lot of potential, by the way." "Really?" Izuku nodded. "Being able to do 6 things at once is powerful. But you need to make it 7? 7? You want me to make another light?" Akari asked. "Nope. When you use Prism, you put all your focus into your lights and forget about your physical body. You need to fight with both." Akari's eyes widened. "That amount of coordination sounds..." Izuku smiled at her, letting all of his pride show. "If anyone can do it, you can?" Akari smiled back, her eyes starting to droop. "Thanks. I did kind of use too much mana though." Instantly she was encased in a bundle of purple blankets, air stitched together around her. Izuku floated her up, the daughter burrito levitating after him as he turned to walk home. Akari let out a little shout in surprise before snuggling into the softness gratefully. "Thanks, Dad. Anytime." 3240. "You know, if you keep jumping through grades, you'll be like the first baby to graduate," Izuku commented. Aurora elbowed him in the stomach, hard. "What he means is congratulations on passing ranks once again, Akari. You've been studying a lot, you deserve this." "Yeah, that's what I said." Akari laughed. "Thanks, both of you. Also, Dad, I'm 280. Not a baby." Izuku and Aurora stared at her in consideration, then exchanged a glance before turning back to their baby. "Sure, honey. Whatever you say." Akari leaned back in her chair and rolled her eyes so hard Izuku thought they were going to fall out. And then Izuku's senses were overwhelmed by mana. His entire sensory range was filled with multicolor mana he had never encountered before. For an instant it was all he could feel, a blanket of energy. At the same time, it wasn't hurting him or his family, yet was doing something else to a huge space around them. And then the mana suddenly vanished as fast as it came. Izuku stood up, glancing at Aurora and Akari who were unharmed yet just as confused. A new presence demanded his attention, yet there was only latent mana. A woman had appeared by the table. She was short, barely coming up to chest. Her eyes were emerald green, just like him, and her long hair was the same shade. The very back of his memory tingled at the sight, something forgotten stirring as he watched her eyes that had always teared up so easily began to do so, his heart calling out to her in some deeply ingrained way that hadn't vanished no matter how many years, decades, centuries had passed. Izuku choked, the word falling off his lips automatically. His mother finally unfroze, let the tears out in a waterfall as she wrapped her arms around him in a full hug. "Izuku." Izuku hugged her back, the feeling so familiar in a way that made him want to cry too. "Hi, Mom." Mom held him tighter. "It's been so long." The nice people said that all of humanity was gone for 5 years, which was not a bad vacation, but then you weren't there, so I didn't know what to do. No one could tell me where you were, so I just hoped you were safe. Your quirks still hadn't manifested, but you were so determined despite it, but there are monsters now and... Izuku gave her a watery smile. This was where his muttering came from. She pulled back to look at him, eyes growing wider as she stared. "You're so tall now. When did your hair turn white?" Mom poked his cloak, confused. And when did you get fashion sense? Aurora laughed. Mom blinked, noticing Aurora and Akari for the first time. Who dash? I have a lot to tell you, Mom. Izuku said. We should probably sit down for this. Izuku talked. His mother listened. He told her what he remembered from those hard early years, the empty longing and having too much time with nothing to spend it on. Her hand gripped his tighter when she learned he was completely alone 6 out of 7 days of the week, and the only sound on the abandoned planet was his own footsteps. Then his voice got lighter as he told her about his training, cleaning the beach so long ago. It had been so satisfying. That day he finally saw the sunrise on perfect sand, not a single piece of debris in view. His mom smiled when he told her about his ever-growing training routine and how proud he was of it. Izuku glanced at the kitchen, where Aurora and Akari were out of earshot. He told her of traveling the planet, falling in love with a goddess without even realizing it. He felt so nostalgic, the memories wrapping around him warm like his cloak. Izuku told her about his teacher, a hardened softy who loved games and their years sparring on his beach until night came, and her husband that Izuku co-owned a cat with. His mother looked amazed when he vividly described heaven and its beautiful cities, landscapes that would take lifetimes to fully explore. He didn't tell her about the sky, the worst pain he'd ever felt. Only Aurora knew about that. But he did tell his mom of the arena, of feeling truly recognized for the first time he could remember and crowds cheering. His mom looked down when he told her of the wedding, of how purely happy he was. Izuku could feel her pride, but there was so much guilt in her eyes with it. Finally, Izuku told her about Akari. How fast she learned, grabbing onto knowledge with both hands, and how amazing her magic already was. Izuku talked until his throat was dry. His mother didn't say anything for a long moment when she finished, fingers fidgeting together. She looked back at him, aching sad yet no more tears came. 1,000 years, Mom whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. Oh my God, Izuku, I'm so sorry I left you. Izuku stilled. He didn't know what to do. Carefully, he pulled her into a delicate hug, looking for the words to say. I forgot what your voice sounded like. Izuku blurted. His mother flinched in his arms, but he kept going, he had to. It's been so many years that I can barely remember you, the details slowly fading no matter how hard I cling to them. Izuku took a breath. But I do have a video. There's no sound, but I can clearly see that bright green trying to teach tiny baby me something. I keep messing up over and over, but you never faltered or stopped, and when I finally got it you were just so proud. I still remember how warm you are, that you give the best hugs in the universe. I still remember you cheering me up with Katsudon. I still remember you, Mom. The tears felt like dropping a burden, a light touch sliding down his cheeks. Mom smiled at him, something vulnerable and soft but determined. I'm so sorry I was gone. But I'm here now, and I'm never leaving again. Izuku smiled back, and green eyes matched as they stood up. Ready to meet the rest of our family? His mother's eyes went wide, the realization starting to set in. I have a granddaughter. Izuku laughed. Yep. Izuku led his mother into the kitchen to meet his wife and daughter. He saw Aurora's eyes note their tear tracks, then soften at the expression on his face. Hi, Akari said brightly. I'm Akari. Your dad's mother, right? Mom nodded. She was shorter than Akari, reaching her chin. Can I call you Grandma then? Mom choked, almost bursting into tears again. Of course you can, honey. She then looked at the goddess next to her. You're Aurora, right? Aurora nodded. Hello, Midoriya. It's great to finally. Mom cut her off a hug, embracing her daughter-in-law. Thank you for being here for Izuku, for making him so incredibly happy. And please, just call me Inko. A soft smile formed on Aurora's face. Okay, Inko. Humanity had finally returned from their unwilling vacation. Everybody was back from whatever world they had been sent to. Some brought back stronger quirks and magic, while others returned completely changed from their experiences. 5 years was a long time to humans, apparently. The media deemed the event the drift, the time all of humanity drifted away in search of new worlds. Around the world, People compared their otherworldly adventures, stories spreading like wildfire as loved ones and friends reunited. The world's governments were immediately on top of the aftermath. Magic was treated like an extra emitter quirk, needing to be registered. The new influx of abilities made it easy for Izuku to register his family with new identities, almost no one bothering to thoroughly check through records. The line to the registry had been pretty long. Izuku wished he had brought a book. Izuku and Aurora were now both listed as 40 years old, since having a biological daughter Akari's age wouldn't make any sense otherwise. Akari passed for 20, a young adult by human standards. Izuku wrote down a mutant enhancement quirk to explain his and Akari's strength, and then just labeled their magic. They just needed to show their magic and it would be approved. He had to keep reminding himself that humans had only known about magic for 5 years, especially when Akari's complex light display left them speechless. Aurora was easier, with an energy quirk that she used along with her light magic interchangeably. They were all listed under the Midoriya surname, something Izuku would really need to get used to hearing again. And just like that, Izuku's entire family was legally human. A few months were given for humans to adjust, to take time off whatever jobs or education they had to go back to. It was more courtesy really, people would be with their family as much as possible after being gone for so long. Not every family had been separated, of course. Plenty of people seemed to have been sent to the same place, and reports showed that anyone in contact had been whisked off together. Izuku didn't want to think about how differently his life could have gone if he had drifted like that. Wings, Dad. He has wings. Izuku walked along the road with Akari, sounds buzzing around them. It was a Kuro year, the cat resting on Izuku's shoulder. He didn't seem to worry about all the new presences around him. They were off to buy groceries, something Izuku hadn't had to do in centuries. Pointing is rude, Akari. I can't help it. It's so strange seeing people with mutations, especially the really cool ones. Mutant quirks were really interesting, since they were nothing like magic or anything Izuku had ever seen before. It was like those humans had gone through another stage of evolution. I know, but Izuku trailed off, his daughter already walking up to the winged boy, waving to get his attention on the crowded street. Izuku sighed, deciding to watch. Hello. Those are your wings, right? Akari asked. The boy stared back at her, confused. His bright yellow wings shifted slightly. Yeah? Who else's wings would I have? Just checking. I'm Akari, by the way. Is that your given name, or? Akari's eyes widened. Right, sorry. I'm Haruto Fuji. You were interested in my wings? Yeah, hard Shizuku coughed. Fuji. Not really used to the whole family name thing yet. Your wings seem really beautiful. Are they made of feathers? Can you fly? Akari fired off, excited. Fuji slowly unfurled his wings, careful of the people passing around them. Reached his full wingspan, a wide 2 meters around the teenager. Thank you. They're made out of some kind of feathers, you're right. I can fly, though it tires me out after a while. Fuji answered. What's it like living with wings? Fuji thought for a moment. Well, I remember how painful it was to grow them. His wings shivered from the memory. They're pretty cool now, though. The main problem is that I need to wear custom shirts, and how they get in the way sometimes. Can I, Akari raised a hand in question, not sure if she was crossing some kind of line or not. Fuji nodded, a hint of pink on his cheeks, and Akari gently felt his wings. Her fingers trailing through feathers as she moved her hands along them in wonder. This is amazing, they're so soft and fluffy. I wish I had wings. The feathers are turning red. Akari glanced back, seeing the poor boy's face turn a similar color. Oh, they're related to your emotions. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable, I'm just super curious about things. Fuji waved it off. It's fine, don't worry about it. You're right, they turn red when I'm embarrassed, like just now. I don't hate this color really, when my wings are red it's kind of like I'm hawks. Akari tilted her head in confusion. Ooh. Hawks? Fuji repeated, seeing her blank look. You know, the third-ranked hero? He has those huge red wings? I guess it has been 5 years, but he's still really famous for all his rescues. Sounds like a cool guy. I know, right? There aren't too many heroes with quirks like mine, but he's my inspiration to be one. I want to swoop in and save people, just like he does. So you're going to become a hero? Fuji nodded, excited. Yep. That's why I want to get into university, though no one really knows what the exam this year is going to be like. He was cut off by a call, and he pulled out a device, eyes wide. Oh no, my mom's going to kill me. I really need to go. I'll see you again? Akari waved as he rushed off. Thanks for letting me feel your wings. The sunny yellow feathers flickered back into red as Fuji ran out of view. You forgot I was here, didn't you? Izuku asked, amused. Akari jumped, startled. Well, I kind of did, sorry. I do that sometimes too. Focus isn't really a bad thing. Dad, why was he that embarrassed? Akari asked. He can probably feel through his wings pretty well if they're connected to his emotions. Imagine if a stranger felt your hair like that, even after asking. That makes sense. I should apologize or something, right? Probably. They walked into the grocery store, buying and thanking the cashier. It really was strange for Izuku. He had a salary in heaven, of course, and was used to paying for things there. But on Earth, there hadn't ever been anyone to pay. They left the store as night started to fall, familiar streetlights showing the road. Cars were slowly trickling into usage, and more people were out getting used to their planet again. Then a portal appeared in the middle of the street, stretching wide. Out of it came a wolf, its fur an unnatural, eye-catching orange. The portal closed behind it soundlessly, and most of the humans backed away from the clear threat. The creature was large, taller than Izuku while it was on all fours. So that's a monster? It was one thing hearing about monsters, but seeing one in all of its glory was different. Red eyes flickered around wildly, and Izuku heard someone scream somewhere behind him. Are you going to kill it? Akari asked. Izuku shrugged, walking forward. The wolf's head snapped to him, growling as he stepped closer. Hello, Izuku said. Are you here to dash? The wolf lunged, jaw wide, and Izuku's hand instantly swung in a deadly arc. He sliced through the center and the monster erupted into golden dust, its blood not even having time to fall before its existence was gone. Guess so. Akari wrinkled her nose at the dust now covering his shirt. Killing actual monsters is a bit messy. I think I like Mom's light animals more. I mean, the body vanishes. No need to clean up a giant wolf corpse. Izuku reasoned. Izuku waved off the thanks of the passerby, and Akari watched him closely as they kept walking. Dad, what do you think of heroes? Is this because of that boy earlier? Or what happened just now? Both. Izuku hummed, considering. I love the idea of saving people, of rescuing. Though I don't really know much about heroes yet, I'm sure my old notebooks have something. You have notebooks from before the drift? Akari asked. Yep. They've just been sitting there for 1,000 years. Couldn't throw them away. I guess I thought they would be useful when humanity came back someday. Akari paused in consideration. Dad, can I become a hero? You know you would need to leave Arcadia for 3 years while you attend hero school, right? Akari shrugged. I'm already ahead of the other gods. 3 years won't make any difference. Besides, this sounds like it'll be more interesting. I know I'll have to be on Earth more if I become a hero. Akari, you're amazing enough to do whatever you put your ridiculous amount of energy into. But, please ask your mother first. Why do you want to be a hero, Akari? To save humans, I guess. I have this much power, but I don't really have much to use it for. Plus, Fuji's doing it. Who? Kid with colorful wings we met earlier. Izuku answered for her. Sure. I would never stop you from saving people, and your father's trained you pretty well. Izuku, you're going too, right? Wait, what? Akari said. Izuku nodded. I don't know much about my old self, but he definitely wanted to be a hero. It sounds interesting, and being a hero would let us use our abilities more easily too. He thought of the monster and the panic and fear the humans around him had at the sight. And Japan definitely needs more heroes right now. Are you going to take the licensing exam? Aurora asked. I heard that it's an easier thing to get into now with that need. It's not like you can attend as a student with Akari. No. Izuku raised his phone, opening U.A's website. But maybe they could use a teacher? Aizawa Shoyuta was tired. This was nothing new, of course. He had always been something of an insomniac, and being an underground pro-hero hadn't helped. Then he'd started teaching high schoolers. But then the drift happened. Aizawa was suddenly warped away to another planet on patrol one night and told that he would have to stay there for 5 years. Monsters were real and could be found on several planets of all kinds of types. Sure, why not? In a world with quirks, something like that was easy to accept. Aizawa was sent to Antica, one of the worlds infested with dangerous wolves. The government was focused on killing these monsters, funding a group of slayers. Aizawa was a logical person. If he was going to survive, and if he was going to continue to be a hero when he came back to Earth, then he needed to learn how to kill monsters. And so he did. His capture scarf was reinforced, durable enough to restrain giant canines, and he learned how to use a sword to slice them to pieces. Interestingly, he could use erasure on mana to forcibly suppress it and prevent magical attacks, but besides that, it had zero use against the wolves of Antica. So he trained as hard as he could to efficiently destroy the creatures he fought, as well as anything that might be on Earth. 5 years later, he was back at U.A with his chaotic, terrifying boss. Niza didn't seem to have changed those who didn't know him. A fluffy, adorable person in a suit, innocent impression only slightly marred by a large scar. But Aizawa could see the harder glint in his eyes, the tighter grips. But right now, his eyes were curious in a way that made Aizawa feel a headache appear in advance. Aizawa, please sit down. I've found something quite interesting. Aizawa sighed, taking his usual seat across from Nizu's desk. That's pretty concerning to hear from you, you know. In response, Nizu turned his computer towards him with a grin. Aizawa's eyes widened. In the clip, a giant wolf appeared from a portal and a white-haired man effortlessly cut through a giant wolf with nothing but his hand. Behind him, a girl stood without a hint of fear, despite the monster. They talked casually before walking away as if nothing had happened. A sunset wolf. Aizawa honestly hated the name, but it fits. Bright yellow fur like the sun, they were incredibly fast. Their bite was highly toxic, and the monster had set the sun on many bright slayers. They were classified as a B-class monster, in the new ranking Earth's governments were creating. Either an immense strength enhancement ability or some kind of cutting quirk. It's not vigilantism, because it's a pretty clear case of self-defense. Vigilante laws are pretty outdated now after drifting, anyway. Why are you showing me this? Izuku Midoriya, 40. Has a family, as well as an impressive quirk and magical ability. Nizu paused dramatically. Applied for the position of heroics teacher, just a week after the Sunset Wolf incident. What? No one applied to be a teacher at UA. Nizu invites them, not the other way around. Especially since the drift, where people were going into the new licensing test the Hero Commission set up. Aizawa knew firsthand how valuable fighters were when dealing with monsters. Nizu clapped his paws. It's intriguing, isn't it? I've never heard of him before. So is he a vigilante coming into the light after drifting? A civilian who got enough experience to think they could teach heroics? Or maybe a new player entirely? I'm going to find out. Aizawa watched a man enter the room, closing the door behind him lightly. Midoriya's hair was pure white, but his eyes lived up to his surname. They scanned the room in an instant, landing on Nizu, but not in disgust, simply interest. Hello. My name is Midoriya Izuku. You're the principal of this school, correct? That's right. I'm Nizu, the one who could be a dog or a mouse or a bear. Nizu gestured for the man to sit, and the man took his seat gracefully. Midoriya nodded, and Nizu smiled before pouring him a cup. Nizu leaned back after the man took it, a smile across his face. But Aizawa could see hints of the brain behind the scenes, gears shifting at a rapid pace as he analyzed the man in front of him. What was completely terrifying was Midoriya doing the same thing. Green eyes gazed back like they were sifting through a database, lighting up with curiosity when they trailed across Aizawa's capture scarf and then appearing thoughtful when he saw his forehead and eyes as if he had already figured out his quirk. You sent us an application to teach at UA. We don't get applications very often, so understandably I was quite surprised. Do you not accept applications, then? I found the form on the school's website and may have assumed too much. Normally, I send invitations to join our staff. Quality staff is essential for a school, after all, especially one of the finest ones in heroics. However, all things have exceptions. Nizu's eyes narrowed, a bit of the innocent act vanishing. Like you, Midoriya Izuku. Why is it that a teenager with no known quirk, rumored to be the last quirkless in some medical circles, appears after the drift, now 40 years old? Not to mention having a quirk, magic, and a family. Your physical form clearly supports the story, along with your post-drift records. Yet with access to information from before, it's a little suspicious, correct? Midoriya sipped his tea, calm. You're operating under the assumption that the drift lasted 5 years. And it probably did, for both of you. Aizawa spoke for the first time. Are you saying, most humans drifted for a 5-year period? Humanity isn't the only race that was drifted, though, and I've seen drifters who had been on my planet for a decade. As for me, I was sent there for 20. You can imagine what meeting my mom again on Earth was like. I had considered that something like that would be possible, but currently all statements point to a drift period of just 5 years. 20 years is quite a long time, and long enough to fall in love and have a daughter that's nearly an adult. You must have a great knowledge of the magic listed on your record, with 2 decades of practice. Midoriya laughed like he was remembering an inside joke. Yeah, I do. I've trained a lot, both my mana and my body. Titan. A mutant enhancer allowing the user to exponentially gain strength through training. It makes sense that you wouldn't have discovered a quirk like that before drifting. Where did you drift, Midoriya-san? Midoriya's voice grew fond, almost wistful. The planet I drifted to was called Arid. It was quiet and peaceful. There were no monsters and almost no other people. But it was very beautiful. I started training, wishing to grow stronger, and eventually met my sensei. Was this sensei from Earth as well? Aizawa asked. Izuku shook his head. No, she isn't. Sensei is incredibly strong. My technique was mostly self-taught, but she sparred with me often and helped me grow. That's how I discovered my ability. And your reinforcement magic? My wife was a natural at magic. She helped show me the basics, and from there, Midoriya picked up his empty cup, and Aizawa watched purple energy flow into and around it like a transparent shell. Then Midoriya let go of it. The cup hit the floor with a thud, yet remained perfectly intact. Fascinating. Nizu noted. Reinforcement magic isn't very versatile, but enhancing objects seems to be quite useful. This was a very refreshing interview. Your exam will be in a week, so please return then. Midoriya smiled, thanking him and nodding to Aizawa before walking out of the office. Aizawa watched his boss slowly drink the rest of his tea once Midoriya left. Nizu's composture was still perfect, but his eyes were a bit too wide and his thoughts seemed to be moving faster and faster. Nizu's paw was shaking when he set his cup down. High spec is a useful quirk, one that has served me well so far. Enhanced intelligence to where an animal can live in a human's world, and then far beyond that. I wouldn't have gotten this far, survived this far, if I didn't have the ability to analyze potential threats as well as I do. Everyone has weaknesses. How limited 13's combat experience is, how Snipe relies heavily on bullets, how your quirk, Eraserhead, fails against mutants and is overall useless without higher skill than the enemy. How Endeavor isn't completely immune to his own heat. Even All Might has weaknesses. A grievous injury in his side that probably wouldn't have been healed if he hadn't drifted to such a lucky planet, and the other, his own naivety. Everyone has weaknesses, Nizu repeated. Ones that my quirk lets me instantly break down and analyze, from abilities to behavior to physical condition. His next sentence made Aizawa's over-caffeinated. Blood freeze. So then how does that man have none? Aizawa watched Midoriya closer this time as the man walked into the viewing room. There was a staff slung across his back now. His smile was light, excited, and his eyes grew curious again when he saw the other teachers. But there was also the ease in which the weapon rested on his back, the way power rippled across his skin as he moved, how his eyes had scanned all of them like he was grasping all their strengths and weaknesses instantly. Midoriya-san. Welcome back to U.A. Nizu greeted cheerfully. Any hints of his fear at their last meeting were already analyzed and dealt with. Thanks, Nizu. You've already met Aizawa Shota, Eraserhead, 1, as homeroom teacher and head of the heroics department. Aizawa nodded to the white-haired man, watching him glance back at him in recognition. This is Sekijiro Ken, aka Vlad King, another heroics teacher. He also has 1 BS homeroom. Here we have Ectoplasm and Ken Ishiyama, aka Cementos, who teach mathematics and modern literature, respectively. Lastly, we have 13, who specializes in rescue, and Majima Higuri, also known as Power Loader. He's the head of the support department. Midoriya seemed quite confused at their hero names, obviously trying not to stare at Cementos, but smiled genuinely. It's great to meet you all. Aizawa stepped forward, feeling the familiar weight of his capture scarf warm his neck. Midoriya-san, your exam will be in 3 parts. First is the rescue portion. Aizawa gestured out the testing window at the fake city. Majima held up one of the robotic dummies. They were nearly as large as an adult. These are the hostages you will save, found in various buildings. Aizawa continued. Several safe spots have been placed around the city, and once you bring a hostage there you will be granted points. They have sensors on them for damage, and points can be reduced if they are injured. If a hostage robot is killed, they do not grant any points. There will be enemy robots, which represent villains and monsters. You can destroy them for a low amount of points, and they will be an obstacle in retrieving the hostages safely. The exam portion will end after 30 minutes have passed, or all the hostages have been rescued. Us staff will be grading your performance for the duration of this exam. Any questions? Do I have any limitations? Midoriya questioned. Other than keeping building damage and injury to the hostages to a minimum? Not really. Midoriya grinned. That makes it easy. There wasn't a hint of arrogance in his voice, the statement said as fact. They watched Midoriya on screen, the many cameras in the fake city providing a nearly perfect view. He seemed completely relaxed, examining the constructed buildings. The white-haired man stood in the middle of the city, waiting. He seemed completely relaxed in his white t-shirt, his staff still sheathed. Begin! Nizu announced through the speaker, and Midoriya vanished. Aizawa blinked, confused. Midoriya wasn't appearing on any of the other cams either. Where did he dash? Ken started. 13 cut him off. Look, the extraction point. At the grassy square, a hostage robot had suddenly appeared, completely undamaged. Then another and another, piling on top of each other. A street full of villain robots turned into a street full of scrap metal. He's not teleporting. Ken realized. He's just moving so fast we can't even see him on the cameras. That's incredible. It's like All Might. I made these robots extra durable, and he's not using that metal staff of his yet they're being obliterated. That means Midoriya's got more than speed. His control is perfect too, each villain destroyed and every hostage rushed to safety undamaged. Majima said, what even is his quirk? Mutant enhancer. Aizawa answered. His strength and speed grow exponentially as he trains. Midoriya flickered into view on a rooftop. After a second of deliberation, he blurred out of sight and a building further along was searched through, hostages appearing outside. He's using the easy vantage points to target buildings with a higher concentration of villains. Aizawa commented. Midoriya's already hit all the obvious targets. We're seeing more of him now as Dash. A loud beep from the speakers cut him off, signaling the end of the test. Nizu grinned. Truly excellent. I don't think anyone's ever done this that fast before. What? It's only been a minute. That's a half-hour rescue exam. 13 blurted, incredulously. Ken and Majima just stared at the screens in pure shock. Ectoplasm gave Aizawa a pained glance, visible even through the mask, and Aizawa let out a deep sigh. This next part wasn't going to be fun. Congrats on completing the first stage, Midoriya-san. Don't worry. This second portion will be a little more interesting. 3 of our staff will be released. We're not pets, Nizu. Ken interjected. Into the city. Nizu continued. The staff win if they wrap their capture tape around you, or outlast you for the full 30-minute duration. Midoriya-san, you win if you knock out every hero within that time. Aizawa winced. On screen, Midoriya hummed. I'm guessing you gave me some limitations this time, right? Correct. You have to limit your overwhelming speed and strength to normal human capabilities for mobility and hand-to-hand combat. However, you may use small amounts of your strength in other ways. And my magic? You're free to use your reinforcement magic as you wish. I'm quite interested in seeing your capabilities with it, after all. Alright. Well, I'm ready, I guess. Eraserhead leapt through the rooftops, jumping from building to building with familiar ease. Ectoplasm ran next to him, his powerful prosthetics making long strides. Ectoplasm's clones made their way in different directions, combing through the streets and camping different buildings. Aizawa remembered when his friend had 30 clones, an invaluable resource in any intelligence mission. Now he had 100 clones, all reporting information as they looked for one Midoriya Izuku. You see the snowy powerhouse yet? Ken's voice crackled through the earpiece. No, not yet. Ectoplasm answered, shaking his head at the nickname. We found scraps of bots though, and they lead a pretty clear path to at least where he's been. We'll keep following the trail. Ken, I know you're terrible at stealth, but be careful. Hey, I'm great at sneaking around. Kansas. You're wearing red and white. Ectoplasm sighed. Can you two banter, after? Fine. Hey Ectoplasm, can you send me another clone? Aizawa just made me worried to be here with only 5. Ectoplasm stilled next to Eraserhead, making him stop too. What? Wait, there are only 5 of my clones there. I gave you 10. Vlad King dash. The earpiece fizzled out. Simultaneously, both underground heroes turned to rush in his direction, adrenaline rising. Vlad King was a pro hero for a reason, and he had several clones with him. But Midoriya somehow got the drop on him, without even using his speed. It was another tense few seconds before they reached the fight. Midoriya was pushing back Vlad King in hand-to-hand combat, countering each punch with 2 of his own. The ectoplasm clones circled around him, exploiting openings and keeping the pressure of the blood hero. Vlad King clenched his fist, enveloping Midoriya in blood and pinning his arms to his chest. Green eyes opened wide in surprise, meaning Ken had probably saved his quirk for just the right moment. A clone jumped in, metal leg gleaming in the light as it swung in an arc towards the man's face. At the same time, another clone flipped forward, heel crashing down in a powerful axe kick. Midoriya leaned back, the first kick passing close enough to ruffle his hair. At the same time, he kicked straight up, blocking the axe kick with his foot. Midoriya then twisted, the second clone falling, and the first one couldn't react fast enough to dodge a kick that pierced straight through, returning him to harmless white ectoplasm. Ken's blood formed into a great sword, thrusting forward. The snowy powerhouse sidestepped easily, the blade cutting open his blood restraints. Ken's face broke its stoic mask as a freed fist shot towards him, only to be stopped by a gray capture scarf as Eraserhead finally got close enough. Midoriya shook it off easily and swung his other hand at Eraserhead. Eraserhead's mind flashed back to the footage of Midoriya ripping apart a sunset wolf with that same hand, and he instantly dropped to the ground, pulling his scarf back out of the way. The blade of wind streaked above his head, slicing through a stop sign. Eraserhead activated Erasure, almost losing his composure at the sheer amount of mana that he could now see, yet was still forced to dodge more wind blades. He felt one graze his arm, blood dripping to the ground. Erasure proved Midoriya wasn't using any kind of magic right now. The air itself turned into a weapon from the sheer amount of strength he possessed. That power was currently being held back because of Nizu's limitation, judging by the fact that Midoriya fighting them hand-to-hand hadn't ripped the heroes apart instantly. Eraserhead's capture scarf snaked through the projectiles, reaching the man and stopping him from firing again. Midoriya paused, looking down at the scarf once again wrapped around his hand. Never seen any material like that before. How the hell is this thing doing all that? The real ectoplasm suddenly struck down from his blind spot and Midoriya rolled out of the way, his arm still held tight by the capture weapon. Ectoplasm's leg hit the ground, the impact resonating through Eraserhead's body and forming a large crater into the city ground. He kept up the assault, powerful kicks letting out force every hit as Midoriya blocked them with one hand. Those legs are pretty interesting. Are they a mutation or something? Nope. They're prosthetics. You would be amazed at how cool alien metal is. Midoriya sighed, almost wistful. Yeah, I probably would be. Eraserhead and Vlad King broke into the conversation. Ken's greatsword formed into gauntlets of blood to avoid cutting Eraserhead's scarf as the capture weapon lashed out at Midoriya like it had a mind of its own. They fought together with ectoplasm seamlessly, building on years of field experience. But their opponent was ridiculously skilled. Midoriya flowed through the battle, catching Ken's enhanced fist before ducking through a swarm of metal legs as the remaining 4 clones attacked. His style was a mix of karate and many others, but mainly something Eraserhead had never even seen before. Every move was perfectly calculated, punches and kicks deflecting attacks and breaking through their teamwork. The fight got even harder when Midoriya finally got time to shake the scarf off again, giving him another limb to fight with. Eraserhead kept erasure on Midoriya, not letting him use magic. They had no idea what his real capabilities were with it, but given how they were already struggling, Eraserhead really didn't want to let him have an ability. Before they realized it, Midoriya had maneuvered the fight back to their original position. He picked up the fallen stop sign, spinning it above his head. Then it was already lashing out, gray metal flashing as the red octagon bashed through clones easily. It moved faster and faster, beating back Ken's blood. Eraserhead's scarf whipped forward to stop the makeshift weapon, but expecting it, Midoriya's hand easily snatched it out of the air. He'd been too careless. Midoriya pulled, yanking Eraserhead towards him. He caught Ectoplasm's kick with his other hand, moving Eraserhead in front of him like a shield in the same instant. Ken's blood punch stopped inches away from Eraserhead's face, and he could see the way the blood hero's face froze at what had almost just happened. Ken also seemed pale. He was reaching his quirk limit. Midoriya used the distraction to swing ectoplasm at them like a human baseball bat. Aizawa gritted his teeth against the blow, feeling his wounded arm ache, and rolled back onto his feet. Blood spikes suddenly rose, finally crushing Midoriya's pole and forcing the man to leap back, giving them some breathing room. Midoriya started to rush again and Eraserhead forced his body to get up again. Then reinforcements finally arrived. 98 ectoplasm clones, 2 of which newly reformed, emerged from the city. Duplicates came from every side, running through the streets and dropping from the rooftops. Together, they surrounded the white-haired man. Midoriya's green eyes went wide. Oh sure dash! He was cut off by a storm of bodies landing on him, covering him from view completely. It was a whirlwind of glinting metal and masks, a white t-shirt standing out vividly in the army's attack. Ken supported from the back, attacks launching at Midoriya at the perfect time. The attacks were slowing down, probably from the amount of blood needed just to keep pressure on their opponent. Eraserhead jumped into the tornado, supporting Ectoplasm's attacks with his own strikes and adding the element of unpredictability. Vicious kicks landed, actually pushing Midoriya back as Eraserhead's scarf disrupted the white-haired man's attacks. But as time went on, Midoriya got less and less overwhelmed, somehow adapting to fighting 101 enemies at the same time. He was learning, understanding their fighting styles more and more. The number of clones was dropping as they were taken out with decisive blows. Eraserhead felt the energy around him grow frantic, more and more combos being countered as Midoriya ducked under one kick, blocked another, and used the momentum to sidestep a third, punched through the stomach of a fourth, let the fifth dissipate from an unlucky spike, and then suddenly grabbed the sixth and threw him at Eraserhead. There was no time to dodge. The sudden impact to his head hit the underground hero like a train. Eraserhead finally blinked, his eyes closing in a single, agonizing moment. And then everything went purple. In a split second, 100 chains shot out, piercing every ectoplasm clone at once. They were beautiful, a vast network of linked pieces of mana bursting into existence at once. The real ectoplasm, how did Midoriya know, and Vlad King were both slammed into a building, the impact knocking them unconscious. Eraserhead watched Midoriya speak, the entire area around them filled with purple light. Good fight, Eraserhead. The man tapped his head with a single finger and Eraserhead fell back, the darkness pulling him into a much-needed nap. Izuku watched a woman walk up to him, casually stepping through the craters and damage in the fake city despite her use of a cane. She was short, and her hair was gray. This was an old human, right? Gods stopped physically aging at a certain point, so this was his first time seeing someone with gray hair and wrinkly skin. How interesting. The cane brought him out of his thoughts, clacking against the ground as she reached him. The woman glanced down at the fallen Eraserhead before her eyebrow raised. At the other two heroes slumped against a wall. Did you do this? Yeah. Izuku answered hesitantly. She was wearing a costume too, so it was probably her friends he just knocked out. She only nodded. Do you have any injuries? No, not really. Who are you? I'm Recovery Girl, the one who keeps all these idiots alive. Recovery Girl answered, bending down to kiss Aizawa on the forehead. Instantly, the cut on the underground hero's arm began to close, without even a scar. Izuku's eyes widened. Healing abilities were pretty rare, and literally lifesavers. Midoriya Izuku. I might be a teacher here. Might? The principal's giving me these practical exams right now. Ah, so that's why you've beaten up those three. Izuku looked down, a little sheepish. Sorry about that. Recovery Girl hummed. It's alright. This is actually better than usual, no one was injured too badly. Well, the two over there are probably going to have a concussion, and at least a terrible headache. Izuku winced. He didn't think he had overestimated the heroes, but smashing people into buildings was a delicate art. Izuku picked up the three fallen teachers on her request, laying them over his shoulder as he followed Recovery Girl to the infirmary. Planning on hurting any more of my co-workers? Izuku tightened his hand on Eraserhead's leg, keeping him from slipping. Well, there's apparently one more part of the exam. They got to her office, and Izuku carefully placed each hero in a hospital bed. He wasn't really sure what to do after that, waiting awkwardly as she looked them over. Recovery Girl waved her cane at him. You know where the infirmary is now. Go, get back to whatever that insane rat is making you do. Izuku paused. You're the only reason this school even runs, aren't you? The hero sighed. Izuku only had to wait minutes before the principal's excited voice rang throughout the fake city once again. You've progressed to the final part of this exam. This part will be a test of endurance. Either escape the city or hold off your enemy for the full half-hour mark. You lose if you're knocked unconscious or are unable to fight. Your only limitation this time is that you won't be allowed to use magic. Nizu stressed that it was an endurance test and didn't even mention defeating the enemy as a win condition. Izuku hadn't even unsheathed his staff yet, so this was probably meant to force him to go all out. There was no warning or command to begin this time. Izuku closed his eyes, focusing with his mana sense on the energy from the other side of the fake city. It was a dense red, coiled around a body that was approaching at high speeds. The magic was familiar. For a second, Izuku thought it was Sekmet somehow, but then he noticed that her bright green was missing from the mass. This person was more erratic, like lightning was lancing through their mana circuits. Izuku opened his eyes as a man landed around 50 meters in front of him, the force traveling throughout the ground as the air stirred. Blonde hair like Sekmet and bright blue eyes like Kensei, but Izuku could easily tell it was a coincidence. Despite the power radiating off him, the man was completely human. Yet his mana felt like Sekmet's, as if he had taken part of her strength. Something to think about later. The tall man wore an eye-catching red, yellow, and blue costume, and his muscles rippled across it as he straightened to full height. Even Izuku knew who this man was, the hero who filled most of young Izuku's notebooks, well known for his unstoppable speed and strength. All Might. A bold name, unless you were also the strongest hero. Young Izuku had wanted the man's autograph so badly, and Izuku just wanted to see how unstoppable the man was. How things had changed. All Might laughed, warm and loud enough to echo around them. You aren't running away, it seems. Izuku shrugged. Nope. That's some real confidence you have there, young man. All Might boomed. Let's see if you can back it up. All Might rushed forwards, right arm back in one of the most telegraphed punches Izuku had ever seen. Barely any of the mana was in the attack, and Izuku almost sighed as he watched it slowly reach towards him. Izuku hadn't been underestimated this much in a long time. He didn't like it very much. Izuku grabbed the large arm, twisting his body with it as he controlled the approaching momentum. He lifted all might over his shoulder, slamming his body down into the concrete. As a human with that much raw power, you probably have to hold back on people all the time. I bet it's rare that you get to go all out, fight with everything you have. All Might aimed a punch at his chin, recovering instantly. Izuku caught it easily, watching as shock filled the hero's face. He punched All Might's chest at twice the speed of the initial blow, sending him skidding back against the asphalt. But now is a great time to do so. The hero's iconic smile turned into something more intense as his blue eyes narrowed. All Might raised his arms in front of him, actually getting into a stance. His muscles tensed against the costume, his mana starting to flow throughout his body. You didn't get as far as someone like the number 1 hero without being able to read people. The first blow slammed into his hand, the shockwave ripping at his t-shirt. The second one was a bit stronger than the first, the third punch moving faster than both. His arms protected his upper body, but for some reason, All Might was also shifting his body to keep Izuku's view off the left side of his stomach. All Might was a boxer. His legs served as a strong foundation, letting him attack at high speeds as his fists flew. Izuku kept on the defensive, blocking and weaving through each strike. They were targeted. Whoever taught All Might seemed to know what they were doing. Izuku started to get an idea of All Might's strength and began to counter. Izuku's physical capabilities weren't an ability. They were him, strength slowly trained through so much training. He couldn't turn it off, meaning he was essentially a walking bomb. Of course, this didn't matter when it was just him and Aurora. It didn't really matter if he accidentally broke a table or dropped a building. But it would matter eventually, he knew that. The first time he visited heaven only reaffirmed it. So Izuku practiced controlling his strength, of knowing exactly how much power he needed to use. He had worked at it until it became instinct. Izuku deflected All Might's next hit, and this time his fist collided with All Might's stomach with the exact same force. The blonde winced from the blow, and his fist smashed down. Izuku flipped over the arm to land a powerful kick on his back, already ducking under the next blow, on reflex as All Might spun around. All Might's fist clenched, mana rushing into it. Nebraska? All Might's arm suddenly spun, rotating mid-strike in a circle as it launched forward and formed a horizontal tornado. Smash! The whirlwind struck Izuku by surprise, the force blasting him through the street. Izuku tumbled across the ground, pushing himself to his feet. Now that was interesting. All Might pushed his advantage, crossing the distance instantly for another punch. Izuku sidestepped, and in the same movement his leg swung up into a powerful roundhouse kick. It viciously collided with All Might's left side, the man's eyes opening wide from the impact. His body went smashing through walls and windows as he flew sideways, buildings collapsing in his wake. Izuku leaped after him, watching the man slow to a stop in the debris. You guard your side too much. Maybe a recently healed injury? Izuku asked. Yes. Healed while I drifted. I am one of the few lucky ones who was given far more than others from the adventure. All Might replied, struggling to his feet. Before, I couldn't even fight a few hours, but then I was back in my prime once more. He stared back at Izuku. You were right, there have rarely been monsters and people to push me the far since the fight that injured me. All Might grinned, teeth flashing. Would you like to challenge me for the title of Strongest Hero? Izuku grinned back. Then he flickered. Izuku appeared in front of All Might's face, moving so fast the air shook, flipping forward in an axe kick. All Might crossed both arms above him to block it on instinct, gritting his teeth under the blow. Izuku brought his hands down on the blonde's head. The shockwave blasted away the rubble around them, shattering the nearby windows. Izuku pushed off, knocking the hero away and backflipping onto his feet. He kept up the assault, increasing the tempo with every attack, every movement as All Might was forced to push himself to keep up. The air shook with every strike, the city vibrating under their feet. Texas smash. Izuku blocked the punch, the burst of wind blowing back his white hair. Izuku kicked up and All Might barely ducked in time, losing a blonde tuft of hair. In the same motion he struck down, bringing all his force onto the ground. Detroit smash. Izuku jumped, watching the earth crumble below him. All Might's legs tensed, enhancement magic flooding into them. Carolina dash. The hero shot into the air like a bullet towards Izuku, red lighting trailing behind him, arms crossed. There was nowhere to dodge without his magic. Smash. Izuku raised both arms against the double chop, blocking the strike in time. All Might's head swung forward into a headbutt as they floated. Izuku twisted in midair to avoid it, kick crashing into All Might and knocking him back towards the earth. New Hampshire smash. Where the blonde immediately punched the ground, rocketing him back towards Izuku. The hero's back hit Izuku's face, the sudden pain disorienting him for a moment before instinct took over. He crossed his arms over All Might then leaned back, suplexing the hero into the ground in a painful takedown. The already mutilated ground broke further, the crater stretching wide. Izuku pushed himself back onto his feet as the blonde pulled his head out of the ground, cracking his neck. Got anything else? All Might asked, raising his fists again. Can you take any more, All Might? Izuku teased back. All Might laughed, blood running down his cheek. Are you familiar with the concept of plus ultra, Midoriya? Further beyond, right? It's the motto of U today, the school that I graduated from, and exactly what I'm about to show you. All Might's fist reared back, and his legs tensed. The red lightning was back, this time crackling around the hero's entire body. Izuku could feel All Might's mana as a tangible force, and might have mistaken him for a god if he didn't know who he was. The energy grew and grew, blue eyes glowing as they contrasted with flashing red. All Might kicked off the ruined street, a shockwave rippling through the ruined road behind him. United States of Dash. He moved faster and faster as the punch streaked towards Izuku, then started to slow. The red lightning emitting off him froze. All Might's entire body was moving at a crawl, like it was underwater as the blonde slowly inched towards Izuku. Sweat could be seen on the man's forehead, unmoving. Izuku started walking, stepping in front of the nearly frozen hero for a better look. This is the result of what Sekmet did over 1,200 years ago. Her small blessing of enhancement magic stockpiled and then exponentially increased, power growing more and more. 200 years was quite a while for humans. In another few centuries, how far would this power go? Soon, this ability would be on par with an average god, if humans could still handle it. Even now, the fact that All Might's body was still moving, albeit at an incredibly slow pace, was proof of that. Izuku walked in a circle around the blonde hero. All Might's eyes were wide, slowly tracking him. They were the only things moving near Izuku's speed. It was Sekmet's mana, but like Izuku's blessing, it had adapted to each person it was passed to until the small changes added up like a game of telephone. Izuku stood in front of All Might and his outstretched fist. Then Izuku slowed back down and punched. All Might shot forward, jumping back into motion like a released spring as his final blow rushed forward. Smash! All Might boomed. Right past his target. The force destroyed the buildings behind him, the wind shattering as a shockwave tore into the ground. Smash! Izuku said softly. While Izuku's punch rammed into All Might's stomach at twice the force of his final smash. The man bent forward, curling into the blow before it launched him flying, the sound of him slamming into a building across the city still an audible boom. There was no sudden blitz from his opponent, this time, so Izuku assumed he finally unconscious. He wasn't dead, Izuku hadn't hit him that hard. Probably. Izuku looked at the destruction around him, of broken buildings and torn roads in the demolished fake city. Not a single window was left unscathed, and debris was strewn everywhere as craters littered the streets. The snowy powerhouse hummed, rolling back his shoulders. Well, that was fun.